The morning they came to strip his title, Cassian Blackthorne was already awake. He had not slept. He stood at the window of the east tower with a glass of Carewin red untouched on the sill, watching torchlight move through the lower courtyard like a wound that refused to close. 14 men. He had counted them twice. They thought darkness gave them cover. They thought the hour gave them courage. They had never understood the first and most important truth about Ravenshire. The walls had no blind side. Every stone in this fortress had been paid for with someone else's fear. You did not ambush a man who had built his house from the raw material of other men's nightmares. You only thought you did. He picked up the glass, took one slow drink, set it back down, and waited for them to knock. What happens next inside that chamber will tell you everything about the kind of man who holds the North, and everything about the woman who will one day make him question whether holding is the same as owning. Stay close to this story. It will not coddle you. Neither did the man who lived it. But the knock came at 4:15 in the morning, which told Cassian that whoever organized this particular insult had no grasp of theatrics. Grand confrontations required daylight. They required witnesses. A knock at 4 in the morning was the move of a coward wearing ambition like a borrowed coat. "Enter," he said. He had not moved from the window. 3 men came through the door. Lord Fenwick Aldred, who governed the southern grain routes and owed his position to Cassian's late father. Beside him, the younger Harwick brother, Tomas, whose family had spent 40 years accumulating grievances the way smaller men accumulated debt. And behind both of them, hands clasped in the posture of a man who believed prayer could substitute for spine, Lord Chancellor Reeves. Cassian looked at them the way a surgeon looks at a body he has been asked to open, clinically, without sentiment. "Your Grace," Aldred began. He had rehearsed this. Cassian could see it in the set of his jaw, the careful distance he maintained from the other two, as though proximity itself was still negotiable. "The Council has reached a determination." "The Council," Cassian repeated. He finally turned from the window. The torchlight caught the angles of his face and did nothing to soften them. He was not a beautiful man. He was the kind of man whose face told you exactly what had been required to produce it, years of making decisions that left marks. A jaw that had been broken once and reset slightly wrong. A scar along the left cheekbone from a duel fought before he was 19. Eyes the color of old iron, which had never once in his adult life communicated warmth by accident. "Which members of the Council?" 12 of the 16 sitting members have signed the resolution, Reeves said. He had a document in his hands. He was holding it the way a man holds a weapon he has never actually used. Under the Ravenshire Charter of Governance, a supermajority decision by the Council carries the authority to, "I know what the Charter says." Cassian crossed the room. Not fast. He never moved fast when slowness produced more fear. He moved like something that had already decided the outcome and was simply giving the other party time to understand it. He stopped 3 feet from Reeves and watched the Chancellor take an involuntary half-step backward. "I wrote half of it." "Your Grace," Aldred again steadying himself. To his credit, the man had genuine conviction, which Cassian found marginally more interesting than cowardice. "The matter of succession cannot be deferred further. You have ruled Ravenshire for 11 years without issue, without an heir, without any indication that you intend to—" "Without any indication that I intend to—" "What, Aldred?" It was not a question. Aldred straightened. "Without any indication that you intend to secure the duchy's future. The northern estates have had 3 drought years in succession. The trade agreements with the eastern provinces require a treaty-bonded marriage to hold. The people require stability. And the Council has voted, under legal authority, to mandate that you accept a betrothal arrangement with Lady Constance Vale within 60 days. Or what?" Silence. The specific quality of silence that happens when 3 men realize that the threat they carried across a cold courtyard at 4 in the morning has just been asked to identify itself out loud. Reeves recovered first. "Or the Council will move to appoint a regent administrator for the duchy's external affairs. Your Grace would retain title and—" "Get out," Cassian said. "Your Grace, the resolution has legal—" "I heard what it has." He walked back to the window, picked up the untouched glass. This time he did not drink from it. He simply held it, turning it once in his hands, and then set it down with a precision that somehow carried more menace than throwing it would have. You have until the east gate opens at sunrise to be outside my walls. All three of you. Take the resolution with you. I will send my response to the council through the appropriate channel, which is my steward, at an hour of my choosing, and it will contain exactly 2 words. The second word will be off. Go. They went. He stood at the window for another hour after they left, watching the torchlight recede through the courtyard, and he felt nothing that could be generously called fury. What he felt was colder than that and more familiar. It was the specific sensation of understanding that the architecture of power was never finished. You could spend 11 years fortifying a position and still wake up before dawn to find men in your bedchamber holding paper weapons. The paper could be signed by 12 men. The fear was still his. You couldn't deed that to anyone. The question was what to do with 12 men who had just revealed the full measure of their courage. Cassian Blackthorne believed in very few absolutes. One of them was this: a threat that fails does not simply disappear. It calcifies. It becomes either a lesson for the man who issued it or a lesson for the man who received it, and the only variable was who learned faster. He began composing the lesson before sunrise. Wait, the stallion arrived on the 4th day of the month, which was a Thursday, though nobody in the lower stables marked the day with any optimism. Word had traveled ahead of the animal with the efficiency that bad news always achieves. The beast had broken 2 men's arms at the eastern breeding farm, laid open a 3rd man's face with a hoof, and resisted every conventional method of handling to the point where the farm manager had sent it to Ravenshire with a note that read, in its entirety, "Your problem now." His name, according to the transport manifest, was Valdris. He was a Darnford black, 17 hands, built like something that had been designed specifically to disprove the idea of cooperation. The grooms who unloaded him at the Ravenshire gate did so from a distance, using the full length of the lead lines and a degree of caution that bordered on religious devotion. Cassian watched from the upper rampart. He watched the way he watched most things, without expression, cataloging detail, the animal's movement, the groom's fear, the specific geometry of the problem. He had paid 1,200 marks for that horse. 1,200 marks was what it cost to demonstrate publicly and repeatedly that Ravenshire could absorb any expense the duchy's competitors could not. It was not sentiment. He did not have sentiment about horses. He had purpose, which was a more durable thing, and the purpose was that the fastest cavalry unit in the Northern Territories rode Darnford blacks, and he needed 10 more of them broken to saddle within the season, and Valdris was supposed to be the foundation. Instead, Valdris was currently trying to remove the east gate from its hinges. "Head groom," Cassian said without turning. Perrin, who had served the Blackthorn stables for 22 years and had the build of a man who had spent most of them being knocked sideways by large animals, stepped up beside him. He was watching the scene below with the expression of a man watching his own obituary being written in real time. "Your Grace, how many men have we tried?" "7, Your Grace. Over 3 days. The last 2 we tried simultaneously, which," Perrin paused, "didn't improve matters." "What's the animal's primary failure, aggression or fear?" Perrin considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "Fear that learned to use aggression, Your Grace. There's a difference in the eye. An aggressive horse wants to dominate. A frightened horse that learned aggression wants to destroy. This one wants to destroy." Cassian finally looked away from the window. "And our current staff are out of ideas, Your Grace. I won't mislead you about that." "No," Cassian agreed. "You never do." He moved away from the rampart. "Find someone else." Perrin blinked. "Your Grace, Ravenshire maintains the most experienced stable staff in the northern—" "I didn't say find someone better. I said find someone else. Different method entirely. Post the position through the village contracts office. Whatever we're doing is not working, which means we need someone who does something we are not doing. I don't care about credentials. I care about results." He was already walking. "Make it clear the horse has injured men. I won't have anyone here under false pretense about what they're facing." He said the last part without looking back. It was the closest Cassian Blackthorne ever came to stating a principle out loud. What? Seraphina Vale arrived at Ravenshire on a gray morning 6 days later with a canvas bag over one shoulder, mud on her boots from the river road, and absolutely no preliminary correspondence. She had not responded to the posting. She had simply appeared at the gatehouse and told the duty guard that she was there about the horse. The guard, a young man named Colton who had been working the gate for 3 months and had not yet developed the particular Ravenshire instinct for filtering unusual situations, had let her through on the basis that she seemed to know where she was going, which, he would later tell people, she absolutely did. She found Perrin in the lower stable yard inspecting tack. She introduced herself by name, stated her rate, which was not a request for negotiation but a declaration of value, and asked to see the horse. Perrin looked at her. She was 26, perhaps 27, medium height, lean through the shoulders in the way of people who have worked physically their whole lives, dark hair pulled back without vanity, eyes that were an unusual shade, something between gray and green, that had the disconcerting quality of not looking away when you expected them to. "You've read the contract terms," he said. "You understand the animal's history." "I heard about it at the White Hare in Carwick 3 days ago. The man who told me lost a finger to a horse in similar condition about 4 years back. He thought the animal was purely aggressive. He was wrong, and the horse died. I'd rather not repeat that outcome." She set her bag down against the fence post. "Let me see the horse, Mr. Perrin." He took her to see the horse. Valdris was in the reinforced pen at the back of the stable block, which had been built for exactly this category of animal, and still looked like it was losing the argument. The fence had been reinforced with iron bracing. The water trough had been moved to outside the pen, delivered through a gap in the planking, because nobody had successfully approached the trough from inside in 3 days. Seraphina stood at the fence and looked at the horse for a long time without speaking. Valdris stood at the far end of the pen, turned partially sideways, watching her. His ears were not pinned. They were moving, which meant he was reading her rather than reacting to her, which was itself a distinction that told Seraphina something important. "He's been hurt by a rope," she said. "Something around the neck or the chest. Recent. You can see it in how he positions himself when he's not moving. He's always slightly turned so that his left side is protected. Whoever tried to break him before I got here used a chest rope restraint, and the horse is carrying that memory like a bruise." Perrin said nothing. He was watching her with a different quality of attention now. "Nobody goes in today," she said. "I need him to get used to me at the fence. That's not me being cautious, that's me telling you how this works. The horse doesn't need someone to overpower him. He needs someone he's decided isn't a threat. That takes time, and it takes consistency, and it takes not doing the thing that hurt him again. Do you have a problem with that approach?" "No," Perrin said. She spent the rest of that day at the fence. She did not bring treats. She did not make sounds. She simply stood at varying positions around the perimeter, moving slowly when she moved at all, never looking directly at the horse for more than a few seconds at a time. By late afternoon, Valdris had halved the distance between them. Cassian saw this from the rampart. He had been standing there for approximately 30 minutes, having intended to observe for 5. He did not know who she was yet. He knew only what he was watching, which was something he could not immediately categorize, and things he could not categorize had a way of requiring his full attention. He found out her name that evening. He also found out her rate, which he approved without comment, and her origin, which was a breeding farm in Carwick Province that had been sold at debt auction 2 years prior, which meant she was working without a fixed position and had been for at least that long. He did not find out why. That particular detail didn't emerge until the second day, when Perrin made the mistake of asking her directly during the noon break, and she told him with the brevity of someone who has had the same conversation many times. The farm owner's son thought employment came with other expectations. It didn't. I left. Then she went back to the fence. Perrin reported this to Cassian at the evening briefing. Cassian considered it for approximately 2 seconds. "Double the rate," she quoted, "retroactive to arrival. Don't tell her it was my decision." Perrin, who had worked for the Blackthorne family long enough to know when not to ask questions, simply said, "Yes, Your Grace," and closed the door. By the 4th day, she was inside the pen. Cassian was at the rampart again. He was beginning to understand that this was becoming a habit, and he regarded that understanding the way he regarded most things that did not suit his self-image, by examining it for tactical relevance and finding, irritatingly, that it had some. He was not watching her because she was a woman working in a space that had been designated for men. He had seen women work. His mother had run the estate accounts for 15 years with a precision that had humiliated two successive stewards. He was not watching her because she was doing something impressive, although she was. He was watching her because she was doing something he had never seen anyone do, which was make a genuinely dangerous animal choose to be less afraid. And she was doing it not through force or strategy, but through some quality of presence he didn't have a word for. On the fourth day, she entered the pen slowly, left the gate open, and stood with her back half turned to Valdres, which was either the most dangerous or the most intelligent position she could have chosen, depending entirely on whether her read of the horse was correct. Valdres moved toward her, not fast, not aggressive. He moved the way frightened things move when they are deciding whether to stop being frightened, with enormous caution, in increments, testing each foot of ground before committing the next. She didn't move. She stood with her hands loose at her sides and let the horse make its own determination. When his muzzle touched her shoulder, Cassian felt something shift in his chest that he chose, immediately and decisively, not to examine. The confrontation happened on the 6th day. Cassian had expected one earlier, simply because the architecture of Ravenshire was not designed for someone who could not be intimidated. It started with Harwick's man. Thomas Harwick, still stinging from the 4 a.m. dismissal, had a cousin on the stable staff, a man named Gregor, who had worked the hay and grain stores for 3 years, and had apparently spent that time developing opinions about who belonged in which part of the duchy. Gregor had made 2 separate comments to Serafina on days 3 and 4, both of which she had declined to respond to. On day 6, he made a 3rd comment in the presence of 4 other stable workers, about women who came down from Carwick thinking they could do what men with real experience couldn't. Serafina finished what she was doing, which was measuring feed portions for the morning, and then she turned and looked at him. "You've tried the horse twice," she said. It was not a question. She had clearly been paying attention to the staff in the same way she paid attention to the animal in the pen. "Both times you used a neck throw to get him down. First time he was up again in 40 seconds. Second time you didn't get a full throw because he anticipated it, and you took a shoulder hit that put you on the ground." She set down the measuring scoop. "You're not bad with horses, Gregor. You're bad with this horse specifically because this horse has a particular history that your technique doesn't accommodate. That's not an insult. That's a description of a gap in information." She picked the scoop back up. "If you want to know what I'm doing differently, ask me. If you want to make comments about where I'm from, make sure they're accurate, because I'm not from Carwick. I'm from the Vale holding in East Carwick, which is not the same place, and the difference matters if you're going to use it as an insult." The stable went quiet in the specific way that spaces go quiet when everyone present is deciding whether to pretend they didn't just witness something. Gregor left and did not return that day. Cassian received the account from 2 separate sources before dinner, which told him that what had happened in the stable had been worth repeating, which meant it had moved people in some direction. He didn't summon her. He filed it and continued his evening. He summoned her the following morning. Wochabt. The message came through Perrin, which was the appropriate channel. It said, "The Duke requests Miss Vale attend him at the upper stable office at the 8th hour." Serafina read it once. She was in the middle of cleaning Valdres's feed area, which she did herself because anyone else who entered the pen still upset the horse's progress. She finished the task before leaving. The upper stable office was a spare room above the main tax storage that Cassian used when he was working the estate rather than receiving. It had a desk, 2 chairs, a window that overlooked the main yard, and none of the formal weight of the castle's interior rooms. He had chosen it deliberately for exactly that reason. It was a room that suggested work rather than hierarchy, and he was curious whether she would notice the distinction. She came in at the 8th hour exactly, which he registered. She did not sit until he indicated the chair across from the desk. When she sat upright, and still in a way that did not communicate nervousness, only economy of motion. He looked at her directly for the first time from close range. What he registered, in the analytical way he registered most things, She was not what the word horsebreaker produced in the imagination. She was not rough or graceless. She was worn in the way of people who have been working since they were old enough to work, but worn carefully, the way good leather wears. And her eyes, that unusual gray-green, were doing to him across the desk what they had apparently done to Gregor in the stable, looking without flinching. Most people who sat across from Cassian Blackthorne found reasons to look at the desk, the window, the door. She did not. "The horse," he said. "He'll carry a saddle by next week," she said. "Rider by the week after, if you use someone light to start. 3 weeks after that, full training work. It'll hold because it's not forced. Everyone I've employed before you has assured me they can break that animal in less time. Everyone you employed before me is wrong." She said it without apology. Breaking and training are different outcomes. Breaking gets you a horse that obeys. Training gets you a horse that chooses to. The second kind lasts. The first kind fails at the worst moment, usually in a situation that actually matters. He was quiet for a moment. "You're telling me my standard methods produce inferior results." "I'm telling you your standard methods produce 7 injured men and a horse you still can't use. You can call that whatever you want, Your Grace." The title came at the end, not the beginning, which meant she knew exactly where it went and was choosing to put it there, after the statement, not before it. He hadn't been spoken to like this in 11 years of holding the duchy. He sat with that fact for a moment, turning it over the way he'd turned the glass on the windowsill the morning the councilmen had come. "You had a confrontation with one of my stable staff yesterday," he said. "I had a conversation with him. He had a confrontation with his own ego. I tried to limit my participation. Gregor Harwick has worked these stables for 3 years. I know, he's competent at grain management, less competent at adjusting technique when technique isn't working. Most people aren't good at that. It's a specific skill. And you are. At adjusting, yes, it's the only skill that saved my life more than once." He looked at her. She looked back. "The comment he made about your origin," Cassian said. "Why not report it?" "Because reporting it requires believing someone with authority over the situation would handle it appropriately. I had no evidence one way or the other about that yet." She said it with complete matter-of-factness, as though this was simply a description of rational assessment rather than an indictment of every institution she had moved through. "I handled it myself." "You've been doing that for a while." "Since I was old enough to know what needed handling." He stood, walked to the window. The yard below was moving through its morning work, grooms and handlers and the distant sound of Valdris testing the fence again, which was already a different quality of testing than it had been a week ago. Less violence, more negotiation. "There are 12 men on the Council of Ravenshire who are currently arranging to constrain my authority over the duchy's external affairs," he said, without preamble and without turning from the window. He wasn't sure why he said it. He didn't have the habit of speaking his problems to strangers. They believe they have legal ground. They may be correct about the letter of the charter, if not the spirit. They have spent the last 4 days imagining that I am considering their position. A pause. "Are you?" she said. "No." He turned back. She was still sitting exactly as she had been. "I'm waiting to see how they move when they believe I'm unresponsive. A man who thinks he has time will show you his full plan eventually. A man who thinks he's running out of time will show you his fear instead. I prefer the full plan. That's a long time to hold still. It requires a certain tolerance for being underestimated. I know something about that." He studied her. "I expect you do." He moved back to the desk. "I want you to assess the full stable stock, not just Valdris. Every animal we have that's been flagged as difficult or unresponsive. I want a written evaluation of each one with your professional judgment on recoverability and method. Perrin will give you access." She didn't say yes immediately, which surprised him. "That's a different scope than what I was hired for," she said. "It is. The rate adjusts accordingly. What's the adjustment? What do you think your time is worth?" She told him. The number was not what he expected from a woman who arrived with mud on her boots and a canvas bag. It was exactly what he would have expected from someone who had just spent 6 days making 1,200 marks of problem horse walk toward them voluntarily. He didn't negotiate. "Agreed. Starting tomorrow." She stood. "Starting today. I'll finish with Valdris and begin the initial observations this afternoon." She walked to the door. He watched her go, which was not something he usually did. Most people he watched on the way in, calculating. He rarely had reason to watch them leave. "Miss Vale?" She stopped, turned part way, not all the way. "You didn't ask who the 12 men are," he said. "The council members." "Not my business," she said. "I'm here about the horses." She left. He stood at the window for a long time after, watching the yard below, watching nothing in particular, feeling, in the specific uncomfortable way he felt things that disrupted the established order of his thinking, that something had just shifted inside the arithmetic of Ravenshire, and that he had not entirely controlled the direction of the shift. She found the first problem on the third day of her expanded assessment. It was not in the horses. It was in the feed records. She had been reviewing consumption tallies against purchase invoices, simply because understanding each animal's behavioral baseline required understanding their nutrition history, and she was thorough by nature in ways that had saved her and cost her in equal measure across her adult life. 3 of the horses flagged as difficult and unresponsive in Perrin's records were animals that should not have been difficult or unresponsive based on their breeding and prior history. They were animals that should have been performing well. They weren't because they weren't getting full rations. The numbers were close enough to be plausible and wrong enough to be systematic. Someone had been shaving the grain allocations for the highest value animals in the stable and pocketing the difference. It had been going on for at least 8 months based on the pattern she could trace. She stared at the ledger for a long time. She was not employed to investigate theft. She was employed to work horses. She was also not the kind of person who had ever successfully looked at a problem and chosen to leave it because it wasn't technically her problem. She took the ledger to Perrin. Perrin went white. He went through the numbers twice, slowly, and then he sat down. "This goes to the Duke," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "Whoever did this has been here for years. The pattern in these records." He stopped, started again. "They would have needed access to both the purchase invoices and the distribution logs. That's not a stable hand." "No," she agreed. "It's not." They looked at each other. Between them was the specific understanding that what they were holding was not just evidence of theft. It was evidence of someone senior enough to control records on both sides of the transaction, someone who had considered themselves safe. "I'll need to be the one to present this," Serafina said. "I found it. I can explain the method. You shouldn't be in the position of delivering it through an intermediary because that gives whoever this is time to prepare a counter-account before you're heard." Perrin looked at her. He had served the Blackthorn stables for 22 years. "Miss Vale, do you understand what you're suggesting?" "I'm suggesting a private meeting with the Duke to present documented evidence of ongoing financial corruption within his household staff." She closed the ledger. "Yes, I understand what I'm suggesting. He doesn't take unscheduled meetings." "Then I'll schedule one." She picked up the ledger. "This afternoon. The corruption isn't going to improve with time." The meeting was at the 4th hour of the afternoon, Asset. She laid the ledger on his desk and walked him through the numbers in the same direct, unhurried way she had explained the horse's fear response in the upper office 3 days before. She did not editorialize. She did not hedge. She showed him the pattern, and she named it. Cassian listened without interrupting. He asked 2 questions, both precise and specific, about the methodology of the falsification. She answered both. When she finished, he sat back and looked at the ledger and at her, in that order. "You understand," he said slowly, "that the person responsible for these records reports to my household steward, and my household steward has been with this family for 17 years, she said. "I know. I looked him up in the employment register before I came here." "You looked him up." "I wanted to know who I might be implicating before I implicated him. It seemed like basic courtesy." He studied her with an expression she couldn't fully read. "Most people in your position would have quietly returned the ledger to the shelf and not done what you just did. Most people in my position don't have a habit of doing what's comfortable." He stood, moved around the desk. He didn't go to the window this time. He simply stood close enough that she was aware of the shift in the room's geometry, the way his presence changed the available space. "You've been at Ravenshire for 9 days, he said. In that time, you've made progress with an animal that injured 7 experienced men. You handled a confrontation in the stables without involving authority. And now you've walked into my office with evidence that one of my longest-serving household members is stealing from me." He paused. "What exactly are you trying to accomplish, Miss Vale?" "I'm trying to do my job, Your Grace." She met his eyes without difficulty. "I wasn't hired to find corruption, and I wasn't hired to manage your staff dynamics. I found both of those things while doing what I was hired to do. I could have ignored them. I didn't. That's not ambition. That's just not being able to leave things broken when I can see what's broken." "Everything in this duchy," he said, very quiet, "is part of a structure. The structure holds because people understand their position within it." "I know where I am in your structure," she said. "I'm the horsebreaker. I work the animals, and I write the evaluations, and I don't interfere in political arrangements. But when I'm doing my job and I find something wrong, I say so. If that's a problem for your structure, tell me now, and I'll go back to the fence." He looked at her for a long time. "You won't," he said. She blinked. "I won't what?" "Go back to just the fence." His voice had a quality in it she hadn't heard before, something that lived below the authority and the coldness, something that sounded like recognition. "You can't. You're constitutionally incapable of leaving the thing that isn't working and walking past it. You know that about yourself." She said nothing. "It's not a criticism," he said. "It's an observation. The same quality that made you look at a horse everyone else had given up on, and see what was actually wrong with him." He stepped back, creating distance deliberately. "The steward will be removed from his position tonight. The person he reported to in the records chain will be investigated. You'll receive formal acknowledgement in the estate documents that the discovery was made in the course of your work, in case the involved parties attempt to create a counter-narrative." She absorbed this. "That's more than I expected." "I protect people who protect Ravenshire," he said, "even when they haven't been here long enough to know that's what they're doing." He moved to the door, held it. "I'll need your written evaluation of the full stable stock within the week." "You'll have it." She left through the door he held and walked back down to the yard, where Valdris was standing at the fence, watching the afternoon light change across the lower stones of the castle wall, and she stood for a moment in the cold air and thought about what had just happened. She thought about the Duke's face when she told him his steward was stealing from him. She had expected anger. She had expected the specific frozen quality that authority produces when it is caught off guard by information it should already have. Instead, she had seen something that looked, briefly, and before he controlled it, like relief. The relief of a man who had been waiting for evidence of something he already suspected but couldn't prove, delivered by a source he hadn't yet found a reason to distrust. She thought about the way he had stood close to her desk, not threatening, not performing power, just present in a way that used all the available space, and the way he had said "you can't," like he already knew the answer. She thought about the fact that in 9 days at Ravenshire, he had adjusted her rate without being asked, protected her position in the stable hierarchy without being prompted, and just now extended the formal protection of his estate records to someone who had been employed for less than 2 weeks. A man of that kind of power didn't do those things by accident. She pulled her coat tighter and went back to the horse. Valdris turned at her approach, ears forward, and came to the fence without being called. This is the part she would remember later, in different circumstances, when everything had changed, the way the fortress loomed above the stables in the last of the afternoon light, and the way the horse came to her, and the way her mind was doing something she hadn't asked it to do, which was trying to figure out what Cassian Blackthorne actually wanted. She had worked for dangerous men before. She knew the taxonomy. Men who wanted compliance, men who wanted performance, men who wanted obedience so thorough it replaced their own thinking. He wasn't any of those. She didn't have a word for what he was yet. She realized with a kind of cold, pragmatic clarity, didn't have any professional reason for spending this much time thinking about it. The letter arrived that night. It came to her quarters in the lower staff house, delivered by a castle runner at the 10th hour, sealed with red wax but no mark. Inside, in handwriting that she did not recognize, "You have made an enemy today. You should have stayed with the horses. Ravenshire does not protect people it cannot use. Ask yourself how long you are useful and plan accordingly." She read it twice. set it on the table, looked at the wall for a moment. Then she went to her bag, took out the small leather notebook she used for stable records, and wrote down the paper quality, the hand, and the specific turn of phrase, "how long you are useful," which told her something specific about how the writer thought about the world. Not angry language, transactional language. The language of someone who thought of people as instruments with expiration dates. Someone connected to the steward, certainly, but possibly also connected to people with larger concerns than grain ledgers. She thought about the council, the 12 men, the political arrangement that Cassian had mentioned with such extraordinary casualness, as though telling her about it was simply a thing that happened, not a thing that signified. She put the notebook away. In the morning, she would go to Perrin. She would not go to the Duke, not yet. You didn't bring a problem to authority until you understood the full shape of it, and right now she had a corner and an edge and nothing that told her where the center was. She slept poorly and was at the fence an hour before dawn. When the light came up over the castle wall, Valdris was standing next to her, which had never happened before, and she stood with one hand resting on his neck and watched the fortress come into color against the morning sky. Somewhere in the upper walls, she was almost certain, a figure was at a window. She didn't look up to check. Cassian Blackthorne stood at the east tower window at the 4th hour of the morning and watched the woman at the fence and felt the weight of 12 men's threat in the back of his chest, like an old fracture that changes temperature before storms. He had seen the runner deliver the letter. He had not intercepted it. That had been a deliberate choice, the same kind of deliberate choice as everything else he did. And he understood it now with the particular clarity of a man who has just realized something about himself that will be inconvenient going forward. He wanted to see what she would do with it. And in the yard below, as the first gray light caught the edges of the fortress stone, his steward was being quietly escorted to a closed room by 2 guards, and 3 floors beneath that, in the correspondence office, a sealed document was being prepared for the Council of Ravenshire, and it contained, as promised, exactly 2 words. None of this, Cassian understood, was the problem. The problem was the name on the letter's inner seal that she hadn't noticed because she'd been reading the text. He had seen the runner's origin. He had traced it in the hour after she'd left his office. The problem was that the seal belonged to Lord Chancellor Reeves, and Reeves was not a man acting alone. And whoever had sent that letter to her room tonight had done so knowing she had spent 9 days becoming something Cassian Blackthorne had not had in 11 years of ruling the duchy. Someone he hadn't decided yet what to do about. The horse moved next to her in the gray yard. She didn't look up at the window. He found, with a precision that surprised him, that he was grateful for that, because he was not ready, yet, for her to see the full measure of what was coming. She didn't sleep after she wrote down the letter's details. She lay on the narrow bed in the staff house and listened to the fortress breathe around her, the specific sounds of a very old building at night, stone settling, wind finding the gaps in mortar that centuries hadn't sealed, the distant rhythm of the watchguard's boots on the upper rampart. Ravenshire at night was not quiet. It was a place that maintained vigilance even when the people inside it thought they'd stopped working. She recognized that quality. She had lived in a body that worked the same way since she was 17. At the 3rd hour, she got up, built the small fire in the room's grate higher, and sat at the table with the letter in front of her. She was not afraid. That was the thing she checked first, automatically, the way she checked an animal's breathing before anything else. Fear was information. She wanted to know if she had it. She didn't. What she had instead was the thing that came after fear got old from overuse, which was a specific cold alertness, the kind that made her good at what she did and had cost her 2 jobs and 1 friendship over the course of her working life, because it had a way of refusing to let her look away from what other people chose not to see. Reeves had sent that letter, or someone in Reeves's household, which for practical purposes was the same thing, which meant the Chancellor of the Council, one of 12 men actively working to constrain the Duke's authority, had spent part of his evening identifying a foreign horsebreaker 9 days into her employment and deciding she was worth threatening. That was not a small expenditure of attention. She thought about what she was worth threatening for. The stable fraud, obviously. She'd exposed that. But the letter had come fast, within hours, which meant someone had known before the end of the working day that she'd brought the ledger to the Duke, and that meant someone in the upper castle had access to information about private meetings in the stable office. She wrote that down too. Then she put the notebook away, put more wood on the fire, and went back to bed. There was nothing actionable at 3 in the morning. Ravenshire ran on daylight and structure, and she would need both. What? Cassian did not sleep either, but that was not new. He had stopped sleeping through the night somewhere around his 31st year, when the full weight of the duchy's administration had settled into him permanently and decided to conduct most of its business between midnight and dawn. He had made a kind of peace with it. The night hours were honest in a way daylight rarely was. Nobody performed in the dark. They only revealed. He was at his desk in the private study by the 4th hour, and the document in front of him was not the council's resolution. It was a list of names. 11 of the 12 council members who had signed the resolution, because one of the 12 he had already known for years, was purely an opportunist who would shift position the moment the winds changed and required no further analysis. The remaining 11, he was mapping. What they owned, what they owed, who their families had allied with in the last decade. Where their money actually came from versus where they claimed it came from. This was not new work. He had been building this map for years, the way a careful man builds all his contingency work, quietly, in advance of needing it, with no visible urgency that would alert anyone that it was being built. Ravenshire's stability over 11 years had come not from Cassian's willingness to fight, but from his willingness to know. He kept information the way other men kept gold, not in piles but in structured holdings, each piece positioned for maximum utility at the moment it became necessary. What was new was Reeves. Reeves was the chancellor. He held his position by appointment, which meant by Cassian's family's authority, which meant by Cassian's authority, which meant that Reeves had signed a resolution intended to constrain the man who had appointed him, and had then sent a threatening letter to an employee of that man's household on the same evening. That was not caution. That was escalation. That was a man who had committed to a direction and was no longer concerned about covering his flanks, which meant Reeves believed he had sufficient backing to move openly. Cassian sat with that conclusion for a while, felt its weight. There was a version of this situation that was manageable through the appropriate legal channels, and a version that was not, and the difference between them was entirely a question of who else Reeves had committed to this direction. If it was only council members, that was a political problem. If it extended into the military administration of the duchy, which meant Sir Aldrich Vane, who commanded the northern garrison and had always kept his loyalties in precisely enough ambiguity to be useful to multiple parties simultaneously, then it was a different category of problem entirely. He wrote Vane's name at the bottom of the list, underlined it once, then he wrote her name above it. Not underlined, just there, in his own handwriting, on the page because he had a habit of writing down the things that required his clearest thinking rather than leaving them in the air where they could drift. Seraphina Vale. 9 days. He understood, with the intellectual honesty he applied to all problems, including the ones he preferred not to have, that the problem of Seraphina Vale was not actually about the horse or the ledger or the threatening letter from Reeves, though all three were connected to it. The problem was that in 9 days she had walked through several of the standard mechanisms by which Ravenshire filtered and classified people, and she had not come out the other side in any of the categories those mechanisms were designed to produce. She wasn't loyal to him. Not yet, possibly not ever in the sense he was used to. Loyalty he had purchased from 100 people, and it behaved predictably. It held until the price of defection dropped below the value of what he was paying. That was not what she was doing. She had no particular reason to bring him that ledger. She had even less reason to stand at a fence in the dark at 4 in the morning, working an animal that was none of her direct responsibility anymore once the day ended. She did those things because she couldn't not do them. He understood that, not abstractly, but in his body, in the way he understood anything true, as a recognition rather than a discovery. He had spent 11 years being the kind of man who could not do certain things either, and it had cost him most of what ordinary men counted as a personal life, and had produced, in exchange, the most effectively governed duchy in the Northern Territories. The cost-benefit analysis of that arrangement had never bothered him until approximately 9 days ago. He put his pen down, put the list in the desk drawer, went to the window. She was at the fence. The light was still gray, the sun not yet above the eastern ridge, and she was standing at Valdris's pen with her coat pulled close and the horse's head over the fence rail near her shoulder. He watched that for approximately 2 minutes longer than he intended to. Then he sent for Sir Aldrich Vane. Vane arrived at the castle before the 8th hour, which meant he'd been in the city rather than at the garrison, which itself was information. He was a compact man in his late 40s, face like worked leather, with the particular stillness of career military men who had learned that motion communicates intention, and intention was better kept private. He took the chair across from Cassian's desk with the ease of a man who had sat in it many times. "Your Grace," he said. "The garrison rotation," Cassian said. "The duty reassignment you submitted last week. The request to move 30 men from the eastern wall posting to the internal courtyard detail." Vane's face did not change. "Standard winter rotation. The eastern wall detail is rougher posting in cold weather. The courtyard positions are warmer. We cycle them through." "You've never rotated in winter before." "We've never had 3 consecutive drought years before." "The men's morale." "Aldrich." He used the first name with precision. Not warmth. Precision. He and Vane had known each other for 15 years, and 15 years did not produce warmth in Cassian, but it produced the specific knowledge of when a man was performing a prepared response versus actually speaking. "I'm not asking you to defend the rotation. I'm asking you who asked you to request it." Silence. Not the silence of a man organizing his thoughts. The silence of a man running through his options. "The garrison operates under my discretion, Your Grace," Vane said finally. "It does," Cassian agreed. "That's precisely why I'm asking. The rotation is operationally sound. The rotation positions 30 additional bodies in the internal courtyard at a time when 12 council members are actively attempting to limit my authority, and the Lord Chancellor has apparently decided that threatening my household staff constitutes reasonable political conduct." He watched Vane's left hand specifically. 23 years of reading men across various kinds of tables had taught him that the hands told what the face was trained to hide. The left hand had stilled on the chair arm with a completeness that was not the stillness of calm. "That rotation is not operational, Aldrich. Don't make me say it plainly." Vane said nothing. Cassian let the silence sit. He was comfortable with silence in a way that most people weren't, and he used that comfort the way a craftsman uses a good tool, without flourish, with exact application. "I've served this duchy and this family for 23 years, Vane said at last. His voice had changed register, quieter, not softer exactly, but compressed. "I submitted a routine document. What you're inferring from it." "I'm not inferring, I'm concluding. There's a difference." Cassian stood. Not to pace, not to move for movement's sake, but because sitting implied an equality of position, and he needed Vane to feel the room differently. "Here's what I know. Reeves is moving. The council has moved legally and failed to move me. The next step is not legal. 30 bodies in the internal courtyard is preparation for a next step that isn't legal." He stood at the window. "What I need to know from you, Aldrich, and I need it now, is whether you are committed to that step or whether you submitted that document under duress I should know about." Another silence. Then, "He said you were going to destroy the duchy anyway." Cassian turned. This was the first time he had looked at Vane directly in the conversation, and he did it with the specific quality of attention that men who had been looked at that way by Cassian Blackthorne remembered for a long time afterward. "Reeves said that." Reeves and Aldred and 2 of the Eastern Holdings lords. Vane's jaw had tightened to the point where the muscle in his cheek was visible. "They said you were going to appoint a Carwick common blood as Duchess, that you'd announced it to Aldred personally, that the duchy's alliance structure would collapse inside a year, and they needed the garrison position to manage the transition." Cassian was very still. "I haven't announced anything to Aldred," he said, and his voice had dropped into the register that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with the moment before a decision gets made. "What I said to Aldred, in the presence of 2 other men, was that the council's resolution would receive a response through my steward. That is what I said." He paused. "What they told you is a fabrication." Vane's face had gone through several things in the last 30 seconds. He looked now like a man who had made a very expensive decision based on a currency he'd been told was good. "Rescind the rotation request," Cassian said. "Today, in writing, through the appropriate channel. The reason you give is operational error. That's all. And then you return to the garrison and you resume your function and you wait. Whatever Reeves has told you will be required of you next. You will find a reason to delay. I'm not asking you to act against him. I'm asking you to be slow. He moved away from the window. Can you do that? Yes, Vane said, after a moment that cost him something. Yes, Your Grace. After he left, Cassian stood in the middle of the study and felt the full shape of what had just clarified itself. Reeves had told the garrison commander that a decision had already been made that hadn't been made. He had fabricated a public announcement to justify positioning military assets for a transition that hadn't been announced. That was not a man who was reacting to the Duke's choices. That was a man who was building a story around a conclusion he had already reached and filling in the evidence afterward. Cassian understood that logic intimately. He had used it himself. The difference was that when he built a story around a conclusion, the conclusion was usually correct. He picked up his pen, added one more name to the document in his desk drawer. He needed to think about timing. He needed to think about sequence. He needed to know who else Reeves had positioned before he moved, because moving against the Chancellor without full information was the kind of dramatic gesture that felt like action and functioned like surrender. He also, with a clarity that was almost irritating in its precision, needed to have a conversation he wasn't ready to have yet. So she found him in the stable yard at midday. Or rather, he found her, which was accurate but phrased incorrectly because Cassian Blackthorne had not in his adult life found himself anywhere he had not intended to be. He had arranged to be in the stable yard at midday because he had business with Perrin about the winter feed contracts, which was true, and because she would be there, which was also true, and he had decided to stop spending energy on the mental accounting that separated those two motivations. She was with Valdris. The horse was saddled for the first time, a light saddle, no rider weight, just the object itself draped across him and buckled carefully. Serafina was walking beside him with one hand on the bridle, not guiding, following. The horse's ears were forward. He was working through something private, some internal renegotiation of what this new weight meant, and she was walking beside him like a question he was being allowed to answer at his own pace. Cassian stopped at the fence, watched for a moment. She saw him. She didn't stop moving. She finished the circuit with the horse, brought him back to the fence, removed the saddle herself, gave the animal a moment, and then came to where Cassian stood. 12 days? He said. 11.5, she said. He's ahead of the schedule I gave you, which I want on record because I quoted conservatively. Noted. He looked at her. She was windburned from the morning, hair pulled back with a piece of stable cord because apparently she had misplaced the proper tie and had not let that stop her from doing anything. Her eyes were that color again, gray-green in the flat winter light, and direct in the way that he had now observed long enough to understand was not a performance. She wasn't watching him carefully. She was just watching him, the same way she watched everything, because she saw no reason to do it differently for rank. I need to speak with you about the letter. She went very still for a fraction of a second. Then, what do you know about the letter? I know who sent it. She looked at him and he watched her absorb that and make a decision about what to say. How long have you known? Since the night it arrived. You let me wake up with it. I considered intercepting it, he said. I chose not to. She studied him. He could see her working through why, and he watched her reach the correct answer because she was the kind of person who reached correct answers and didn't soften them for comfort. You wanted to see what I'd do with it, she said. Yes. And? You wrote down the physical characteristics and the phrasing and the timing, which together told you more about the sender than the content did. You didn't bring it to me immediately, which means you're not reflexively dependent on authority in a crisis. And you were at the fence before sunrise, which means you decided the work was more important than the threat, and also that staying in a closed room felt like the wrong kind of waiting. A long moment. You watched me, she said. Not accusatory, just locating the fact. From the East Tower. Yes. For how long? Longer than I planned to. She turned and looked at Valdris, who was standing near the water trough in the easy way of an animal that had begun to trust his immediate environment. Then she looked back. The letter came from the Chancellor. It came from his household, which is the same thing. Which means someone in the upper castle told him about our meeting within hours of it ending. Yes, which means you have someone in your immediate circle with a direct line to the opposition. She said it with the exact same tone she'd used to tell him his standard methods had produced 7 injured men, not softened, not delivered for impact, just placed in front of him as a fact that required attention. That's a more immediate problem than the Chancellor. He looked at her. I know. Do you know who it is? I have a candidate. I need another day to be certain. She nodded, not pressing, accepting the boundary of that information the way she accepted the limits of the horse's readiness as a real thing rather than an obstacle. What did you want to tell me about the letter? That I know who sent it, that you are not unprotected here, and that the threat in it may become more material in the next 2 weeks, and I need to know whether that changes your intention to remain at Ravenshire. She looked at him for long enough that he was aware of the pause as a deliberate thing. Does it need to change my intention? No, he said. I would prefer it didn't. Something shifted in the space between them, not dramatically. Cassian had spent his adult life observing dramatic shifts in rooms, and he knew what they looked like, which was usually nothing like this. This was quieter than that. This was 2 people standing at a fence in the cold with a horse nearby and a duchy in slow internal combustion and something aligning between them that had no name yet and possibly shouldn't. Then it doesn't, she said. He should have left it there. He knew, with the tactical clarity that governed most of his interactions, that the sensible thing was to close the conversation at an agreement and create distance. He did not leave it there. Why did you come to Ravenshire? He said. She blinked. Whatever she'd expected next, it wasn't that. The posting, she said. There are other postings. You were working out of Carwick. We're 6 days' ride from Carwick. There are holdings between here and there that would have taken you. Why Ravenshire, specifically? She was quiet for a moment. Not evasive quiet. Thinking quiet. Because Ravenshire has the hardest horses, she said finally. The ones nobody else has fixed. The ones that are already supposed to be done. She paused. And because a place built on that much concentrated power either holds together completely or comes apart all at once, and I've found that those are the only 2 kinds of places worth working in. The ones in the middle are just comfortable. He held that. You don't want to be comfortable, he said. I want to be useful, she said. That's not the same thing, and Ravenshire needed someone useful. She picked up the saddle from the fence rail where she'd draped it and walked back toward the tack room. He stood at the fence for a moment. Valdris was watching him from the water trough with the level assessment of an animal that had recently decided people might be acceptable after all. Cassian thought about 12 council members and a chancellor and a garrison commander who could be slowed but not stopped indefinitely, and 30 men not yet in position but close, and an informant somewhere in his household passing information to a man who had decided that power and bloodline were synonyms. He thought about the way she had said those are the only 2 kinds of places worth working in. He thought about what it meant that she had accurately diagnosed Ravenshire in 9 days when most men with full information had spent 11 years misreading it. He thought about the way she hadn't asked who the leak was, had accepted the boundary, had not pressed. He walked back into the castle, called his household secretary, gave 3 instructions in quiet succession, 2 of which concerned council correspondence, and 1 of which concerned a set of rooms in the east wing of Ravenshire that had been closed since his mother's death and would require 3 days to make habitable. He did not examine that last instruction closely. Examining things closely was a habit he had built his duchy on. It was also, he was beginning to understand, a habit with limits. The informant revealed himself that afternoon, not through any investigation Cassian conducted, but through the specific impatience of a frightened man who waited 2 days too long and then moved too fast. It was the Undersecretary of Household Accounts, a man named Perrin, not Perrin the stable master, but a different man with a nearly identical name, which Cassian had always found faintly insulting as a coincidence, who had been in his household for 4 years and had been, it emerged, in Reeves's pocket for 3 of them. He was intercepted attempting to remove a copy of Cassian's private correspondence from the records room. Cassian had him brought to the study. The man was 32, thin, with the kind of face that went paler than its natural color under stress, until it looked like unfinished clay. He stood in the center of the room with the document still technically in his possession, because Cassian had told the guards not to take it. He wanted to see if the man would offer it or wait to be asked. He waited to be asked. "Set it on the desk," Cassian said. He did. "Reeves," Cassian said. The undersecretary swallowed. "I don't know what. You sent him the record of my meeting with Perrin 2 days ago. You sent him the record of my meeting with Vane this morning. Both of those were sealed sessions. The only access was through the household accounts corridor, which you supervise." He was sitting, not standing, which he'd chosen deliberately because standing over a frightened man produced one kind of information and sitting across from him produced another. He wanted information. "Who else?" "I don't." The man stopped, started again. "I only passed the summaries. I didn't have full content. I only knew you'd had meetings and approximately how long they ran." "Who gave you the room timing?" A pause that told him everything. "The runner who brought the lunch service," Cassian said. "The boy, 14 years old. Did Reeves recruit him or did you?" The undersecretary closed his eyes. "He recruited him. Before me. I didn't know about the boy until last month." Cassian sat with that. There was a quality of anger available to him in that moment, the specific anger of a man who has discovered that his household has been read like a public document for years, that even the 14-year-old in his lunch service had been turned, and he was aware of it the way he was aware of all his feelings, as information about the situation rather than a response to it. "You'll write everything down," he said. "Every contact, every piece of information passed, every instruction received, full and accurate, because I will be verifying independently, and the gap between what you tell me and what I can verify will determine what happens next. You have until the dinner hour." He stood, picked up the document the man had tried to remove, looked at it once. It was a draft letter to the council. Not the 2-word response he'd promised, a longer one. Something he'd been composing for 3 days about the charter's interpretation, something that hadn't been sent yet. Reeves had wanted it early, which meant Reeves had wanted to know what Cassian was planning before Cassian executed it, which meant Reeves was not confident that the council's legal position was actually strong enough to hold if Cassian chose to argue it formally. Good. He set the letter back down, went to the window. The stable yard was empty now, the light having dropped with the late afternoon to something flat and gray. Tomorrow would be colder. The forecasters he employed said the first real snow of the season would come by the week's end, and once it came, it would sit on the high ground through March, which meant the mountain passes would close, which meant the duchy's external communications would route through the lowland roads, which meant any military movement by the council's allied holdings would be visible on those roads for weeks before it arrived. Cassian had always found winter clarifying. Everything exposed itself eventually when there was nowhere to hide it. He was still standing at the window thinking through sequence when the knock came at the study door. Not a guard, not a secretary. The knock was too direct. 3 even beats. No hesitation. "Come," he said. Serafina opened the door. She was still in her work clothes, had clearly come directly from the stables, and she was holding a piece of paper in her hand with an expression he hadn't seen on her before. Not fear, not the cold alertness she usually wore. Something different. Something that looked underneath all her control, like the beginning of anger. "I need to show you something," she said. She crossed the room, set the paper on the desk next to the draft letter, and stepped back. He looked at it. It was a stable record. One of the routine daily logs she'd been keeping since expanding her assessment, but the date at the top was not from the past week. The date was 8 months ago, and the entries in the log described, in neat systematic handwriting that wasn't hers, the slow calculated decline of 4 specific horses in the stable stock. Not the feed fraud. Something else. Something that looked, as he read it with the specific attention it deserved, like the deliberate preparation of evidence. Evidence of a different kind of decline in Ravenshire's stable resources. Evidence that, if presented to the right authority in the right context, would suggest that the duchy's military cavalry stock had been consistently mismanaged under the current administration, under him. He read it twice, raised his eyes to hers. "Where did you find this?" he said. "Hidden in the wall cavity behind the grain storage tack cabinet," she said. "Someone put it there recently. The dust pattern around the loose plank was only a few days old." He looked at the paper again, at the date, at the careful entries. Someone had not only been stealing from his stables and feeding information to his enemies, someone had been manufacturing a historical record, placing it in a location where it could be discovered at a moment of their choosing, and the record was designed to look like evidence of the Duke of Ravenshire's administrative negligence. Not negligence, incompetence, the kind that a council with legal authority over external affairs could use to justify an expanded mandate over internal affairs too. This had never been about the grain ledger or the 60-day betrothal deadline or even the 30 men in the courtyard rotation. This was a case. Someone had been building a legal case against him, piece by piece, inside his own walls, for months. Cassian set the paper down, felt the room very precisely. She was watching him, and he was aware that she was watching him, and he was aware that she had brought him this and could have done otherwise, and he was aware that whatever the full shape of this conspiracy was, she had now placed herself so thoroughly in the center of it that walking away from it was no longer a realistic option for her even if she wanted it, which meant he had a decision to make about what that required of him. He picked up the paper, set it inside his desk drawer on top of the name list, locked the drawer. "I need you to do something," he said. "All right," she said. "Not what is it? Not why me? Just all right." He looked at her, at that quality she had of not flinching from what the room was actually doing. "Tonight, at the Winter Assembly in the Great Hall, the quarterly gathering, every noble in the district will be there. I need you present." She didn't move. "In what capacity?" "In the capacity," he said, and his voice was careful in a way it rarely was, precise in a way that meant the words were being chosen one at a time rather than in the usual groups, "that I intend to make public." The silence that followed had a different quality from the silences earlier in the day. She held his gaze. He held hers. She had brought him evidence that changed the entire shape of what he was facing, had brought it directly and without calculation, and had stood in his study waiting to be told what it meant. And he was about to tell her that what it meant was that the war inside his walls was going to move into the open tonight, in front of every person in the district who had spent years deciding what and who Ravenshire was, and that she was going to be standing next to him when it did. And she had already said all right before she knew the cost. He was going to make use of that. He understood, with the cold, complete honesty he applied to himself more rarely than he applied it to others, that he was going to do something irrevocable tonight, and that it would protect her by placing her where nothing in Reeves's manufactured case could touch her, and that it would also be true in a way that had nothing to do with strategy, and that he had never in 11 years made a public decision in which those two things were the same. 8 o'clock, he said. "The East Wing corridor. Perrin will send someone with appropriate dress." She looked at him for one more moment. "Your Grace," she said, and this time the title was at the beginning, not the end, and its placement meant something entirely different than it had in the upper office 2 weeks ago. She left. He sat at the desk for a long time, listening to the fortress settle around him, feeling the full weight of what he was about to do, and the full clarity of the fact that he would do it regardless, and the specific quality of that certainty, which was not the certainty of strategy. It was the certainty of a man who has identified the one thing in a duchy full of managed assets that cannot be managed, and has decided to stop trying. The East Wing corridor was lit with candles that cost more per hour than most working men in the district made in a day, and Seraphina stood in it at 10 minutes before 8, feeling the weight of borrowed silk against her skin, like a foreign language she hadn't agreed to learn. The dress had been delivered by a woman who introduced herself only as the Duke's wardrobe keeper, who had appeared at the staff house door at the 6th hour with a trunk, 2 attendants, and the particular brisk efficiency of someone who had been given instructions and intended to execute them without interpretation. The dress was deep charcoal gray with silver thread at the cuffs and collar, structured in a way that did not ask Seraphina to be anything other than what she was, but rendered that thing in a vocabulary the Great Hall would understand. She had looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand when it was done, and had thought, "This is what it looks like when a very powerful man decides to say something in public." She was the statement. She understood that. She was not uncomfortable with it in the way she might have been at 20, when being used for a purpose would have felt like reduction. She was 27 now, and she understood that everything in a structure like Ravenshire carried meaning beyond itself. And the question was not whether you carried meaning, but whether the meaning you carried was your own. Hers was. That was the thing Cassian Blackthorne had apparently understood about her before she'd needed to explain it, which was itself a thing she kept turning over in her mind, the way you turn over a stone that looks ordinary and is heavier than it should be. She heard his footsteps before she saw him. She had already learned that he moved with a specific economy, not quiet exactly, but deliberate. The kind of deliberate that had nothing to prove and therefore didn't waste motion on performance. He came around the corner from the upper corridor and stopped when he saw her, and she watched something cross his face that was fast and immediately controlled, and that she catalogued without comment. "You're on time," he said. "You said 8 o'clock. Most people interpret an instruction like that with a margin. I don't have a margin for things that matter." He studied her for a moment. Then he offered his arm, which she took, and they walked toward the great hall, and neither of them spoke. And the silence had a quality of things already decided rather than things being avoided. The great hall was full. Every seated noble in the district had come, and several who were not seated but were connected enough to receive the quarterly assembly invitation. Servants moved along the walls with trays. The fire in the main hearth had been burning since mid-morning, and the room had reached the specific warmth of a space that has been preparing for a long time to hold many people. Cassian walked in with her on his arm, and the room changed temperature without changing actual degrees. Seraphina felt it move through the gathering like a wave. The precise moment of recognition, then recalculation, then the specific social stillness of people who need to decide how to respond before they commit to any expression. She had grown up understanding how rooms worked, how power organized a space, how the presence of the unexpected thing required everyone to locate themselves relative to it before they could continue. She had just never been the unexpected thing at this scale before. She kept her eyes forward. Lord Aldred was 12 feet to the left of the entry. She saw his face as they passed. He was not subtle about what he was feeling, which was the shock of a man whose fabricated story has just found a way to become true. Reeves was farther back, near the east wall, and he was more controlled. His face did something small and careful when he saw them, and Seraphina felt rather than saw Cassian register it in the slight change of his arm under her hand. Not tension, the opposite of tension, the settling of a man who has confirmed the location of the thing he was looking for. They reached the head of the room. Cassian turned. He did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. Cassian Blackthorne's voice at normal volume carried because rooms made space for it, the way rooms make space for things they have learned to fear. "Lords and representatives of Ravenshire," he said, "I thank you for your attendance at the Winter Assembly. Before the evening's business, I have an announcement of personal and political significance." He paused. One breath. "It is my intention to take a duchess. That duchess will be Miss Seraphina Vale of East Carwick, currently in the employ of Ravenshire as head assessor of the duchy's stable holdings. The formal announcement of betrothal will be registered with the duchy's records office tomorrow morning." The silence that followed was not the silence of an empty room. It was the silence of 40 people simultaneously running calculations. Seraphina stood next to him and kept her face composed and felt her heart doing something it hadn't done since the first morning she'd walked into a pen with an animal that could have killed her, beating fast and steady at the same time. The rhythm of a body that knows it is at a turning point and has not yet decided whether that is good. She had said all right in his study. She had meant it. But all right at 5 o'clock in a private room, and all right at 8 o'clock in front of 40 nobles, with Aldred's face doing what it was currently doing, were separated by a distance she was only now crossing. Aldred spoke first. He was not quiet about it. "Your Grace, with respect, this is not possible under the terms of—" "The duchy's betrothal statutes," Cassian said, "require registration with the records office and a waiting period of 60 days before the formal bond. They do not specify bloodline requirements for a Duchess of Ravenshire. The charter has no such provision. I know this because I reviewed it this afternoon, as I imagine several of you will do tonight. He moved his gaze around the room with the specific patience of a man who has already read the document everyone else is about to check. Miss Vale is a freeborn citizen of Ravenshire province, a professional of established reputation, and a woman of integrity I have observed directly. The announcement stands. He turned to the evening's business. She did not have a chance to speak to him alone until the assembly had been running for an hour and a half, during which she stood where she needed to stand, said what she needed to say to the three people who approached her directly, and watched the room arrange itself into its new configuration with the focused attention of someone reading weather before a storm. When they finally had a moment in the corridor off the east entrance, she spoke first. "You could have told me the full scope of what you were planning." "Yes," he said. "You chose not to. I chose to tell you what was necessary for you to make an informed decision about whether to be present." He looked at her. "If I had told you the full text of the announcement in advance, you would have spent the intervening time analyzing it rather than deciding. I needed you to decide first." She considered this. It was not dishonest exactly. It was the kind of honesty that selected its moment, which was a category of behavior she recognized because she had used it herself in situations where she knew the information would produce the wrong preparation. "It was still a removal of choice," she said. "Yes, I'm aware." Something shifted in his face. "I am not a man who has practiced asking for things." She held that. "Is that an apology?" she said. "It's a description," he said. "The apology is implied by my awareness that I owe you one." She looked at him for a long moment in the corridor with the sounds of the assembly audible through the door and the cold air coming up from the stone and the particular quality of the moment pressing on both of them. "All right," she said again. Third time. She was becoming aware that those two words were becoming a kind of architecture between them. He started to say something else. The door opened. It was Perrin. Perrin, who had not been at the assembly. Perrin, who should have been at the lower staff dinner. Perrin, whose face in the doorway of the east corridor had a quality she had never seen on it in 11 days of working beside him, which was the absolute bleached flatness of a man who has seen something he cannot organize. "What?" Cassian said. His voice had dropped 2 registers in 1 syllable. "Your Grace." Perrin's eyes moved to Seraphina and then back. "There are men in the east stable, 6 of them. They came through the lower gate 40 minutes ago with a garrison pass signed by Commander Vane." Cassian went very still. "Vane rescinded the rotation request this morning." "Yes, Your Grace. The pass is dated this morning, before the rescindment was logged." Perrin swallowed. "They have the fabricated stable records, the ones Miss Vale found in the wall cavity. They're claiming the records are evidence of an active investigation into the duchy's military assets." He stopped. Then, "One of them is a council auditor." The corridor went cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. Cassian turned and walked. Not fast. The walking of a man who is moving at exactly the speed his thinking requires, and no faster, and whose thinking is moving at significant velocity. Seraphina followed. Perrin fell in behind her. The east stable by night was a different space than by day. Darker through the middle section where the overhead lamps were spaced wider, the sound of the horses carrying differently in the cold air. The 6 men were positioned near the tack room where Seraphina had found the concealed records. 2 of them had lanterns. One of them, a compact man in his 40s with the council's gray livery, held a leather satchel. He turned when they entered and produced from somewhere in his expression the specific combination of official neutrality and personal satisfaction that Seraphina associated with men who had been waiting a long time to be in the right room. "Your Grace," the auditor said, "I am Councillor Benwick, appointed investigator under the Council's authority to examine claims of administrative misconduct in the management of Ravenshire's military stable holdings. I am authorized under the resolution passed 11 days ago to conduct audits with written notification submitted 48 hours in advance," Cassian said. "I haven't received notification. The 48-hour requirement is waived in cases of active evidence risk." Benwick held up the satchel. "We have in our possession documented records demonstrating sustained negligence in the management of cavalry assets. Records recovered from within these stables 6 days ago." Seraphina heard the date and something cold moved through her. 6 days ago. She had found those records 2 days ago. She had found them in a wall cavity that had been disturbed recently, which she had read as recently placed. But 6 days ago meant they had been placed before she found them, not in the hours before, which meant the timing of her finding them had been arranged too. The loose plank, the slightly disturbed dust, not a hiding place, a reveal, calibrated for her to find them, bring them to Cassian, and create the appearance that the Duke had been made aware of evidence that a council investigation could then claim he had attempted to conceal. The whole sequence had been engineered. She was the mechanism. She had walked into his study with the evidence in her hands, and she had been the mechanism. She looked at Cassian. His face was showing nothing. "Those records," he said to Benwick, "are fabrications. The handwriting, the dates, and the content can all be verified against actual stable logs from the same period. Miss Vale has been conducting a full assessment of these stables for 10 days and can speak to—" "Miss Vale's assessment," Benwick said, and his voice shifted into something that had been prepared, "is itself a matter under review. Her employment was contracted unusually quickly at an unusually high rate following a direct meeting with your grace. The records office has flagged the transaction." He opened the satchel, produced a document. "There is also the matter of the stable theft investigation. The dismissed employee has submitted a counterstatement claiming that the records Miss Vale presented to you were altered by her to implicate him falsely." Serafina felt the room do what rooms did when the geometry changed without warning. Every available surface became a potential edge. "That's a lie," she said. "Miss Vale." Benwick's eyes moved to her with the precision of a man who had been waiting for her to speak. "You are currently the subject of an ancillary inquiry. I would recommend—" "She is my announced betrothed," Cassian said. His voice was quiet. The quietness that she now understood was his most dangerous register. "She speaks in this stable at her own discretion. Your announcement this evening," Benwick said, "is itself relevant to the inquiry. A betrothal to a woman who is the subject of an active investigation, announced on the same evening council auditors arrived at the estate, creates the appearance of—" "Get out of my stable," Cassian said. Benwick did not move. "Your Grace, under the council's resolution. You have no jurisdiction in this stable tonight because your 48-hour notification requirement was not waived by any provision I can identify in that resolution. If you have the specific charter citation that provides the active evidence risk waiver, produce it now, and I will read it in front of witnesses. If you cannot produce it, you are trespassing, and this conversation is over." A pause. Benwick produced no citation. He closed the satchel. "We will return," he said, "with the appropriate documentation." "I expect you will," Cassian said. They left. All 6 of them, through the lower stable door, lantern light disappearing in the dark outside. The stable was quiet. One of the horses shifted. Distantly, Valdris moved in his pen. Serafina stood in the middle of the tackroom floor and worked through what had just happened. Not the immediate confrontation, the full sequence. 6 days. The records had been in the wall for 6 days. She had arrived at Ravenshire 11 days ago. Someone had placed fabricated evidence in the stable within 5 days of her arrival and had designed the placement for her to find, which meant someone had known she was coming and had understood what kind of person she was before she arrived. The posting. The position had been advertised through the village contracts office, the same office whose records would show that Ravenshire had sought specifically a person with her exact profile. Non-guild, independent contractor, no institutional loyalty, willing to work difficult animals. The posting had been designed to attract her specifically. She looked at Cassian. He was looking at the door through which Benwick had left. "The posting," she said. Her voice was even because she needed it to be even. "The position I applied for." "Yes," he said. He was still looking at the door. "You didn't post it." A pause. "Perrin posted it on my instruction." "But the specific parameters, non-institutional, independent contractor, Carwick Province." He turned, and the thing she saw on his face was something she had not seen there before, which was not the controlled absence of expression he usually wore, and not the rare moments of something warmer she'd observed in the stable office. This was a man who had just arrived at the same conclusion she had and was watching her arrive at it simultaneously and was dealing with what that looked like from his side. I needed someone with a specific profile, he said. I was aware I had a problem in my stable administration. I needed an assessor who had no prior connection to any of the families involved in the council dispute, who couldn't be threatened through institutional standing because they had none, who would be genuinely too competent to dismiss. He stopped. The parameters were mine. You drew me here, she said. I drew someone with your qualifications here. I didn't know you. You drew me into a situation you knew was dangerous. I disclosed the danger. The contract terms specified the horse's history. I increased the rate before you'd been here a full day because I understood the actual risk you were taking. She breathed through that. And the rest of it, expanding my scope, the meeting about the ledger, tonight. Those were not in the original design, he said, and his voice had a rawness in it she hadn't heard. I designed the position. I did not design any of what happened after you arrived. She looked at him, at his face in the dim stable light, and she understood, with the cold precision she brought to things she would have preferred not to see clearly, that he was telling her the truth. That the position had been constructed, that she had been selected before she knew she was being selected, and that everything between them since her arrival had existed inside a frame she hadn't been able to see because she hadn't known the frame was there. You should have told me, she said. Yes, he said. No qualification, no architecture around it. When did you know I was going to be more than the assessor you designed the position for? He was quiet for a moment. Then, the second day. You were at the fence before dawn and I was at the window, and I understood that I had constructed a situation I could no longer entirely control. A pause. I have been trying to determine the appropriate response to that fact ever since. And tonight was your determination. Tonight was me understanding that protecting you required making you unavailable to be used against me. That the fabricated case only works if you remain someone who can be discredited. His jaw was tight. I am aware that in protecting you, I also used you. I am aware that those two things can both be true at once, and that the combination is not a position I would accept from anyone else. She stood with that in the cold, stable air. The honest thing, the thing she couldn't get past even though she wanted to, was that the protection was real. That standing next to him tonight in that hall, in the gray silk, as his announced betrothed, she had become the one person in the district that Benwick's inquiry could not touch without touching Cassian directly. She had gone from a contractor who could be discredited to a political reality that would cost his enemies more than they were prepared to spend. He had done it with one sentence in front of 40 witnesses. The other honest thing was that it had also been the most public statement of personal intent she had ever witnessed from a person who had apparently not made one in 11 years. Both things were true. She understood both things. She had always been built for holding multiple true things at once. When this is over, she said, you will not make decisions about what I need to know and when I need to know it. You will tell me what you are doing. You will tell me why. I will make my own determinations about what I do with that information. Yes, he said. If you agree to that now and fail to practice it later, I will leave. Not in anger, because it will mean we don't work. I understand, he said. She held his gaze for a long moment in the dark stable. She thought about the fence and the horse walking toward her, and the morning light on the castle stones, and a letter with Reeves's seal that she had catalogued at 3 a.m. without fear, and what it cost, and what it produced to be a person who could not leave broken things where she found them. All right, she said. 4th time. She was going to have to find another phrase. Then Perrin, who had been standing near the door in the specific stillness of a man who has heard more than he expected to and will be processing it for some time, said, Your Grace, there's something else. They both looked at him. Perrin's face had the look of a man who has been working for a family for 22 years and has just run out of road. Commander Vane sent a rider 20 minutes ago. He's at the east gate. A breath. He's asking to speak to you before he loses the ability to, Your Grace. His words. Another breath. He says the rotation he rescinded this morning was already executed before he submitted the rescindment. 30 men are positioned inside the courtyard walls, and he says there are riders from Lord Aldred's estate on the south road. The stable went very still. Cassian looked at the door, at the yard beyond it, at the dark above the castle wall where the banners of Ravenshire moved in the winter wind. He had spent 11 years building a position, and the position was under siege from inside, and the 48-hour window he'd used to end Benwick's audit tonight would be filled with documentation by morning. And by morning, 30 men who had been told a story about transition and managed change would be standing in his courtyard, and riders were on the South Road, and the man he'd asked to be slow had instead sent a warning because being slow had run out of time. He turned to Serafina. She was already looking at him with the expression he had first seen at the fence on the second day. Not fear. The thing that came after fear burned out, the clear, cold readiness of a person who has understood the full weight of the situation and has decided to remain in it. "I need to know," he said quietly, "if you are with me in this." Not the way tonight was. Not the way the stable assessment was. Completely and with full knowledge of what it costs. She didn't hesitate. "I've been in it since the fence," she said. "You just didn't know it yet." He looked at her for one moment longer. Then he turned and walked out of the stable and into the winter dark of the courtyard, and she walked beside him, and above them the stone walls of Ravenshire rose against the night sky with the permanence of things that had survived every previous attempt to bring them down. Somewhere in the castle, Reeves was receiving a message she couldn't read yet. Somewhere on the South Road, riders were already moving. And the man who had ruled the North for 11 years through the management of information and the patience of a person who could hold still longer than anyone else was walking into the first crisis of his reign that he had not seen the full shape of in time to design the ending. The only variable, and he was beginning to understand this with a precision that cost him something, was the woman walking beside him who had been drawn here by the shape of who she was and had remained past every reasonable point of departure. Whether that was enough for what was coming, he did not yet know. What he knew was that by morning, the kind of man he had been for 11 years would no longer be sufficient, and that what replaced him was going to have to be something he had not yet become. Vane was at the east gate with his hat in his hands, and the specific posture of a man who has used up all his available forms of self-deception and arrived at the raw material underneath. Cassian reached him in 4 minutes. Serafina stayed 2 steps back and to the left, which was not a position she'd been told to take, but one she'd calculated on her own, close enough to hear everything, far enough that Cassian had room to work without managing her presence. "Talk," Cassian said. Vane talked. The rotation had been executed at the second hour of the afternoon, 6 hours before Vane submitted the rescindment request. Reeves had sent a separate authorization directly to the garrison's second officer, a man named Harst, who reported to Vane in structure but had been in Reeves's pocket. It now emerged, for longer than Vane had known. The 30 men were in position. They were not armed for assault. They were armed for containment, which was a different problem in a specific way. It meant the plan was not to take the castle by force tonight, but to prevent anything from leaving it. No riders out, no messages. A quiet siege of information while the council's audit team returned in the morning with the proper documentation and the legal fiction of an administrative investigation covered whatever came next. "How many of those 30 men are Harst's direct loyals?" Cassian said. 8, maybe 10. Vane's jaw worked. The rest followed the rotation order because it was a valid signed rotation. They don't know what it's for. And Harst. He's in the north courtyard, running the positioning. Aldred's riders. 4 hours out, maybe less. They're riding hard. Vane looked at him. "Your Grace, I submitted the rescindment because I believed you. I still believe you. But I waited too long to see which way this was going to fall, and now people are in positions I put them in, and I don't know how to undo that cleanly." Cassian looked at him for a long moment. Vane was not a traitor in the complete sense, which was worse in some ways than if he had been, because a complete traitor was a solved problem, and a half-committed man was a variable. But a variable with 23 years of garrison knowledge and 8 loyals of his own inside those walls was also, if handled correctly, a resource. "You can undo it," Cassian said, "by doing the next thing right. The men who followed a valid rotation order are not the problem. Harst is the problem. Can you get to him before I do?" "Yes." "Don't. I need him where he is and unaware for another 30 minutes. He turned. Addressed Serafina without preamble. The north courtyard has one entrance from the east wing corridor and one from the lower gate passage. Both will be watched. There's a third access through the old water conduit passage that was sealed in the renovation 12 years ago and reopened for maintenance 3 years ago and never properly closed again. She looked at him. You want me in the north courtyard. I want you to know where it is and how to reach it if you need to. He met her eyes. I'm not sending you anywhere. I'm telling you the landscape. Where does the conduit passage start? Behind the east stable tack room. Stone floor. Pull the iron ring on the third flagstone from the north wall. It's a crawl for about 40 feet, and then it opens into the coal storage beneath the north courtyard. He paused. One breath. I need 30 minutes to move pieces. After that, it either holds or it doesn't. She held his gaze. What are you going to do in 30 minutes? Take back my house, he said. Us. He did it without armor and without ceremony, which was not bravado. It was calculation. A man in armor moving through his own castle at night announced himself as a man preparing for violence, which put everyone in a defensive position and made the next 30 minutes harder. A man in his assembly clothes, moving with the unhurried authority of someone who owns the stones he's walking on, made a different statement entirely. He made that statement through 3 rooms and 2 corridors before anyone in Harst's containment formation understood what was happening. The first thing he did was find his household guard captain, Den, who had been kept away from the assembly's aftermath by a manufactured domestic emergency in the West Wing that had turned out to be nothing, which told Cassian exactly how far in advance this evening had been planned. Den was in the west corridor with 4 men, confused and irritated and very relieved to see the Duke walking toward him with a face that communicated clear instructions. Cassian gave him 3 sentences. Den took his 4 men and went. The second thing was the council chamber, where 2 of Benwick's men had stationed themselves, apparently under the impression that holding the administrative center of the castle held some tactical value. Cassian walked into the chamber, looked at both of them, and said, with the quiet of a man who has decided something, "You can leave this room on your own, or you can be removed from it. I'm giving you 30 seconds to determine your preference." They left. He closed the chamber door, locked it, put the key in his jacket. The third thing was harder. Reeves was in the east parlor. Cassian knew this because Reeves had been using the east parlor for 2 months as an informal meeting space, always requesting it specifically, and Cassian had allowed it while tracking which room's information had been leaking and mapping the pattern, and the pattern had consistently pointed back through the east parlor's adjacent wall, which shared its cavity with a passage to the upper correspondence office. He walked into the east parlor, and Reeves was there with 2 other men, neither of them anyone Cassian had expected. One was a holdings lord from the far eastern district who had always maintained complete neutrality in duchy politics, or appeared to, and the other was a lawyer Cassian did not recognize whose traveling clothes suggested he had come from outside the duchy entirely. Cassian stood in the doorway and looked at the 3 of them, and understood, in the specific way that understanding arrives when you have been moving fast toward a conclusion and then reach it and find it worse than projected, that this was not a council political action. This was an externally funded one. The lawyer was not here for duchy law. He was here for whatever framework existed one step above duchy law, which meant somebody outside Ravenshire's borders had decided to invest in its political reorganization. "Lord Chancellor," he said. Reeves stood. He had the composure of a man who is committed to a position so completely that composure is all he has left, and he is determined to spend it slowly. "Your Grace, I think you'll find that the situation tonight is best addressed through—" "Sit down, Reeves. Your Grace." "Sit down." Reeves sat. Cassian looked at the Eastern Lord. "Marvell. How long?" Lord Marvell had the grace to look at the floor. 8 months, he said. "And the funding?" Silence. Cassian looked at the lawyer. "Where are you from?" The lawyer said nothing, which was itself a kind of answer, because a man with nothing to hide names his origin. "Here is what is going to happen," Cassian said, and his voice in the east parlor was very quiet and very final, the voice he used when he had finished analyzing and begun executing. "Reeves will be taken to the holding rooms in the lower castle tonight. Marvell will remain in his current apartments under house arrangement until the nature and extent of his involvement can be documented. The man I don't recognize will remain here until I know who he is and who sent him. He paused. Den. Den appeared in the doorway with 2 guards. Reeves stood. He had been holding himself together with the specific rigidity of a man who has run the numbers and knows they don't come out in his favor, but refuses to let that show until the last possible moment. You cannot do this under the Charter's provisions for council. The council's authority extends to administrative matters, Cassian said. Accepting external funding to facilitate the reorganization of a duchy's governance is not an administrative matter. It is a different category entirely, and the Charter has provisions for that category too. He met Reeves's eyes. You spent 8 months building a case against me inside my own walls. You used my employees. You used my stable records. You used a 14-year-old runner in my lunch service. His voice did not change pitch. That was the most dangerous thing about it. I am genuinely curious what you thought was going to happen when I found out. Reeves said nothing. His face had gone the color of old ash. Take him, Cassian said. John. The north courtyard at 11 at night was cold and lit by 4 wall torches and occupied by 30 men in garrison formation who had been standing in containment positions for 3 hours, and were, Cassian judged as he walked into the space from the east wing entrance, beginning to understand that the evening had not gone according to anyone's plan. Harst was in the center of the formation. He was a stocky man in his 30s, competent in the way of soldiers who follow orders well and originate them poorly, and he had the look of someone who has been waiting for a signal that hasn't come and is starting to run alternative calculations. Cassian walked into the courtyard, and every man in it looked at him. He did not draw a weapon. He did not raise his voice. He walked to the center of the courtyard and stopped 10 feet from Harst, and said, to the full formation, Lord Chancellor Reeves is in custody in the lower castle. Commander Vane has submitted a formal correction to the rotation order that placed you here tonight. You are standing in my courtyard on the authority of a man who is currently being held for conduct that falls outside the council's legal mandate. He paused. That means you're standing here on no authority at all. He watched the formation absorb this, 30 men doing the math in real time. Harst moved first, not toward Cassian, toward the east gate, which was the exit, because Harst had calculated faster than Cassian had given him credit for and had landed on the correct answer, which was that this situation was over and the only remaining question was how far away from it he could get. He didn't get far. Vane came through the east gate with his 8 men and blocked it with the practiced efficiency of a career soldier who has redirected his considerable experience toward a problem he actually wanted to solve. Harst stopped. Vane looked at him with the expression of a man who has known another man for a long time and is disappointed in a way that has moved past anger into something colder. Stand down, Harst. Harst stood down. The formation dissolved over the next 5 minutes in the way that military formations dissolve when the purpose they were assembled for evaporates. Not in panic, not in confrontation, simply in the steady realization by individual men that they had somewhere else they were supposed to be. Serafina found him at the north courtyard wall at 10 minutes past 11. She had not used the conduit passage. She had come through the east wing corridor and talked her way past the single guard at the courtyard entrance by the simple method of walking as though she had every right to be there, which she was beginning to understand was something you either had the Constitution for or you didn't. He was standing at the wall with his back to the courtyard, looking at the dark hills beyond the battlements, and he had a cut along his left forearm that she hadn't noticed until she was close enough to see it in the torchlight. What happened to your arm? She said. Harst's man. In the east corridor. He glanced at it. It's not deep. Let me look at it. He turned. She took his arm and examined the cut in the available light. It was a knife cut, 2 inches, not deep but bleeding with the persistence of cuts in that location, and she pressed the cuff of her sleeve against it with the matter-of-fact competence of someone who has field-dressed worse. He let her. He stood very still and let her do it and said nothing. Reeves is in custody, he said after a moment. I heard. Aldred's riders will reach the south gate in 3 hours. When they arrive and find no mechanism to enter, they'll sit on the road and wait for instructions from a chain of command that no longer exists. By morning, they'll go home. and the external funding. The lawyer I found in the East Parlor is from a neighboring duchy I have had a cold trade dispute with for 4 years. This was not a council action. It was a proxy operation. The council provided the legal cover and the internal access. Someone else provided the money and the mandate. She kept the pressure on his arm. That's a different problem than the one you started with. Yes, his voice was flat. Not with the controlled flatness of suppression. The flatness of a man who has been running at full capacity for 5 hours and has reached the other side of something and is standing in the aftermath of it. The duchy's external relationships will need to be restructured. The council will need to be restructured. The household staff will need to be audited in full. He paused. The betrothal announcement will need to be addressed. She looked up from his arm. Addressed how? She said. He looked at her. In the torchlight and the cold, with his assembly clothes and a knife cut on his arm, and the north courtyard behind them, slowly emptying of men who had been standing in it for the wrong reasons, he looked like what he was, a man who had just fought a battle without a battlefield and was not entirely certain what he had won. I announced it in front of 40 witnesses to protect you from a legal mechanism that was being built around your presence here, he said. That was the tactical reality. You know that. I know that. He held her gaze. It was also the only true thing I said out loud tonight. You know that too. She looked at him for a long moment. The wind moved over the battlements. Somewhere below, Valdris moved in the stable. I know that, she said. He reached up with his free hand and touched her jaw, once, with the specific carefulness of a man who does not often touch things gently. Then he lowered it. There will be a formal period, he said. The charter requires 60 days. I will not use those 60 days to manage you or arrange you or make decisions about what you need to know. His voice had something in it she hadn't heard before, below the authority and the coldness and the tactical precision, something that sounded like the acknowledgement of a cost he was willing to pay. I will tell you what I'm doing. I will tell you why. And you will decide. Yes, she said. I will. He turned back to the dark hills beyond the wall. She stood beside him. They were still standing there when the shouting started. It came from the south rampart, sharp and multiple. The specific pattern of voices that weren't calling for routine attention, but for something else entirely. And before either of them had fully processed the sound, one of Den's men came through the courtyard entrance at a run. Your Grace, he was breathing hard. The south wall. Someone got through before the gate locked. He stopped, caught his breath. There are men in the inner corridor, 6 at least, maybe more, armed. They came up through the lower passage. Cassian's face went to stone. The lower passage. The route through the old East Quarter foundations that connected to a maintenance access below the south wall, and that appeared on no current map of the castle because it predated the last renovation by 60 years and had been removed from the architectural records during his father's time for reasons that had never been fully documented. 3 people alive knew about that passage. Cassian, his former master of works who had died the previous spring, and Perrin, who had served the Blackthorn stables for 22 years, and who had, Cassian now understood with the specific sensation of a floor dropping away beneath him, told him about Seraphina's discovery of the stable records 2 days after he should have reported it. Not the undersecretary, not Harst, not Reeves's household. Perrin. Cassian was already moving before the thought finished forming. Through the courtyard entrance into the east wing corridor, calculating the interior geography of his own fortress in the way you only know a place when you have spent years understanding how it would be taken from you. Seraphina was 2 steps behind him. The lower passage comes up in the east stable corridor, he said, not stopping. If there are 6 men, and they know the route, they're not here for the castle. They came for something specific. The evidence, she said, the ledger, the fabricated records, everything that documents the conspiracy. It's in the study, 3rd floor. He stopped at the east stairwell, looked at her. Den has 2 men on the study corridor, but he pulled one to the courtyard. There may be 1 man up there. She met his eyes. In the low light of the corridor, her face had the look he'd first catalogued at the fence on day 2, the clear, cold readiness that wasn't the absence of fear, but was what happened to a person when fear had been processed and discarded so many times that it no longer slowed the necessary thing. Go, she said. He went up. She went for the study corridor from the west stair, which was longer, but would bring her in from the opposite direction, which was not an accident, which was the decision of a person who had spent 11 days learning the geometry of a place and understood, without being told, that you covered both approaches or you covered nothing. The castle moved around them, stone and fire and dark, the specific aliveness of a fortress at crisis. Every corridor a choice, and every choice a consequence, and the night not yet over, and the south wall breached, and somewhere above them in the third-floor study corridor, the documentation of everything that had happened over the last 3 months was sitting in a locked desk drawer that would take approximately 30 seconds to open by force. Cassian took the east stairwell 3 steps at a time with a cut on his left arm, and the sound of his own breathing and the full weight of 11 years of a duchy that had just tried to swallow itself. And he understood, in the way that people understand things when the body has stripped away everything that isn't essential, why men became most dangerous at precisely the moment they had the most to lose. Not because desperation made them reckless, because it finally made them honest about what they were willing to do. He hit the third-floor corridor at a run. 2 men were outside the study door. His own guard was down on the floor, not dead, breathing, but down. The study door had a crack in the frame where it had been forced and hadn't yet given. Both men turned. Cassian did not slow down. He hit the first man with his shoulder at full momentum, driving him into the wall, and took the second man's arm when it came up with a blade and turned it with the specific economy of a person who learned to fight in conditions where technique was the only physical advantage available. And the blade came free, and the first man was recovering, and from the far end of the corridor came the sound of someone coming up fast from the west stair. The second man had a friend behind him, a 7th, who had not been in Den's count, who came through the study door with the frame finally broken and a document satchel in his hand. Cassian looked at the satchel, at the man holding it, at the 2 men between him and the man holding it. Somewhere behind him, the west stair door opened. He did not look back. He knew the footstep. "The one with the satchel," he said. "I see him," she said. She came past him at a speed he hadn't seen from her before. Not running exactly, but moving with the full commitment of a person who has made a decision and is executing it without reservation. And the man with the satchel moved for the east stairwell, and she cut the angle on him with the spatial intelligence of someone who has spent years reading how bodies move before they move, and she hit him at the stairwell door with enough force to drive him sideways into the wall and close one hand on the satchel strap and hold. He was bigger than her by 50 pounds. She held. Cassian was already through the 2 men in the corridor, one of whom had lost the will to continue, and the other of whom discovered in the next 4 seconds what happened when Cassian Blackthorne decided a situation was over, and it was over, and the satchel was in her hands, and the 7th man was on the corridor floor, and the castle was loud now with boots from the lower levels, as Den's full complement finally understood where the problem actually was. She stood at the stairwell door with the satchel in both hands, and her breathing hard, and a bruise already coming up on her forearm, where the wall had found it, and her eyes bright with the aftermath of whatever it had taken to hold. He crossed the corridor to her, took the satchel from her hands, checked her arm with 2 fingers, quick and careful. "It's fine," she said. "I'm fine." He looked at her. "You cut the angle," he said. "I know how things move before they move," she said. "It's what I do." He held the satchel. The documents inside, the ledger and the fabricated records and the undersecretary's full written account and the lawyer's papers from the East Parlor were intact. He could feel the weight of it, everything that had been built against him and everything that documented the building of it, in his hands. Below them the castle was resolving itself. He could hear it in the pattern of voices, the lowering urgency, the shift from crisis frequency to containment frequency. Den's voice, specific and steady. The south wall settling. He looked at Serafina in the broken light of the study corridor, and she looked back at him with her arm bruised and her silk dress wrecked at the hem from a castle floor that hadn't been swept for a corridor nobody used. And neither of them said anything for a moment because the moment was already speaking. Then Den appeared at the east stairwell with 4 men and assessed the corridor in 2 seconds with the efficiency of a man who has been doing this for 20 years. "South wall is secured, Your Grace. The men who came through the lower passage are contained. We have 8 of them total." He looked at the men on the floor, at Serafina, at the satchel. "Should I?" "Yes," Cassian said. "All of it. Everything documented, everything secured, nobody moved without my specific instruction. Yes, Your Grace. Den took his men and dealt with the corridor. Cassian turned back to Serafina. She was looking at the study door, still off its frame, the damage visible in the wood where it had been forced. She had an expression he hadn't seen on her before. Not the cold readiness, something that lived on the other side of the readiness, something that people only showed when the body had run the full course of what it could hold and arrived somewhere quieter. He reached out. She put her hand in his before he finished the gesture, which he registered and did not comment on. They stood in the corridor. Below them, in the south courtyard, a man began to shout. Not in alarm. In anger, the specific anger of someone who has been cornered and is expending the last thing available to him. The voice was Reeves. Cassian recognized it. He was out of the holding rooms, either through force or through a guard who hadn't been properly briefed on what tonight was. Reeves was out of the holding rooms and somewhere in the south courtyard, and his voice had the quality of a man who has nothing left to manage and has therefore stopped managing. Cassian looked at the stairwell. Serafina looked at him. At the satchel. At the stairwell. Don't, she said. He looked at her. Not like this, she said. Not running through your own castle after a man who has already lost. That's not how this ends. That's how you give him the last thing he has left to take from you. He stood very still. She held his hand with both of hers, and she looked at him with the directness that had never once in 11 days been performance, and she said, "End this the right way. The way that holds." Below them, Reeves's voice was getting louder. Cassian breathed, felt the full weight of what 11 years of managing a duchy by controlling its information had produced. Not a fortress, a target, not loyalty. A network of people waiting to see which way the weight fell. And now the weight had fallen, and the men who had built the network were in custody, and the documents that proved everything were in his hands, and the woman next to him had just driven herself into a wall to hold them there, and the question of what came next was not about Reeves. Reeves was already finished. The question was what Cassian Blackthorne was going to be when the man he had been for 11 years was no longer sufficient. He looked at her. "You're right," he said. He didn't move toward the stairwell. What happened next would be decided in the morning in the council chamber, with the documents and the testimony and the full clarity that daylight and proper authority produced. What happened next would be the kind of ending that could not be undone by a subsequent legal challenge or a competing narrative, because it would have been conducted with every procedural protection intact. What happened right now, in the corridor, was that Reeves's voice reached its highest pitch, the pitch of a man who has made his final argument to an empty room, and then it stopped. Footsteps. Den's voice, measured, the sound of a situation being managed. Silence. Cassian turned toward the west stair. Serafina walked beside him. Not behind. Beside. They were one floor from the great hall, and the night was not over, and Aldred's riders were 3 hours from the south gate, and there were 8 men in containment in the south courtyard, and a lawyer whose name he still didn't know was sitting in the east parlor under guard, and the full accounting of who had funded this operation, and from which neighboring duchy, and why was a project that would take weeks. But the castle was his, and the documents were in his hands. And the woman walking beside him had held a satchel against a man 50 pounds heavier than her, because she understood, without it ever having been articulated, that some things were worth holding regardless of the cost. He understood, with the particular precision of a man standing at the threshold of something he cannot take back, that the next step through the west stair door was not the end of the crisis. It was the end of a version of himself that had governed the crisis. And what came through that door with him would be different in ways he had not yet mapped. And then the torch at the west stair entrance went out. Not guttered, not flickered, extinguished. In the darkness before Cassian's eyes adjusted, a hand closed on his arm. Not Serafina's, she was still beside him, and he felt her go still. This hand came from the stairwell side, from the dark, with a grip that knew exactly what it was doing. A voice, very close, very quiet. "The lawyer is not from the Eastern Duchy, Your Grace. He was never from the Eastern Duchy." A pause. "He's from your father's household, and the man who sent him has been waiting 23 years to collect what your father owed him. Tonight was never about the council." The grip released. In the dark of the corridor, Cassian stood perfectly still with the satchel in one hand, and Seraphina's hand found his other arm in the black and held it. And he understood with the complete finality of a man who has just seen the actual shape of the thing he has been fighting that the crisis he had spent 11 years preparing for had not been the one that arrived tonight. The one that was coming was older than his duchy, and it was not finished. The torch came back. Not immediately. Long enough that the dark had settled into the corridor like something with weight. Long enough that Cassian had run the voice twice through his memory and confirmed what he already knew, which was that he had never heard it before in his life, which meant the man who had spoken had been in this fortress tonight for the specific purpose of delivering those two sentences and departing. Professionals didn't linger. They placed the thing and left. Seraphina's hand was still on his arm when the light returned. She released it without comment, which told him she had spent the dark seconds the same way he had, thinking rather than reacting, which was the difference between people who survived complicated situations and people who simply experienced them. "Your father's household," she said. "He died when I was 19, Cassian said. "Whatever he owed it for a long time before that. And you didn't know." "No." He said it the way he said things that cost him, flat, direct, no space around it for softening. "I knew he had debts, financial ones. I settled them in the first 2 years of holding the duchy. I did not know there were other categories." She looked at him in the restored torchlight. "The lawyer is still in the east parlor." He moved toward the west stair. "And I am going to find out his actual name tonight, even if we don't sleep until dawn." They went down together. The man's name was Soren Vale. He had no relation to Seraphina. He confirmed that himself when he saw her, with the specific clarity of a man who has decided that the portion of this evening involving deception is over, and what remains might as well be conducted honestly. Vale was a common enough name in the province. The coincidence had apparently not been lost on whoever engineered the evening, and Cassian filed that detail for later. He was 44 years old. He had worked as a legal representative for a man named Crest Alderin, who held the Duchy of Morn, which shared Ravenshire's southeastern border, and had been in a trade dispute with Cassian over the river passage rights for 4 years. He had traveled to Ravenshire at Aldorin's instruction. His mandate had been to provide legal architecture for the council's resolution, which had given Reeves the framework he needed to make an internal political action look like administrative procedure. All of this Soren Vale told Cassian in the east parlor with a guard at the door, and Seraphina at the window in the kind of exhausted precision of a man who has been running a complicated operation and watched it fail, and has now recalculated the cost of continued silence against the cost of cooperation. "Aldorin," Cassian said. "Yes. The river passage dispute. This was his resolution. He believed the dispute would not resolve through negotiation. He had indicators that the council was already dissatisfied with your governance, and he provided resources to accelerate that dissatisfaction into action." Vale paused. "He did not expect the speed of your response tonight." "He made an error," Cassian said. "Several," Vale agreed, with something that in different circumstances might have been professional candor. "The primary one being that the dissatisfaction inside your council was genuine but shallow. Men with grievances are not the same as men with commitment. When the structure started to fail, they stepped back from it. And Reeves," Vale looked at his hands, "Reeves was not shallow. Reeves had a different grievance entirely, older than the river dispute, older than Aldorin's involvement. He believed your father had blocked a legitimate claim of his family's to a portion of the eastern holdings. He had been building a response to that for a very long time." A pause. "Alderin found him, not the other way around." Cassian sat with this. In the parlor's firelight, the full shape of the thing finally assembled itself. Two separate architectures of grievance that had found each other and decided to share a structure. Reeves's personal history and Aldorin's border ambition, held together by a legal framework and an inside operation and a fabricated paper case that had been building in his own walls for 8 months. 23 years. He thought about what Reeves had spent 23 years becoming, how completely a man could organize himself around a wrong that nobody else could see, how the machinery of that kind of patience produced something that looked like competence and functioned like a slow weapon. He did not feel sympathy. He felt the particular cold recognition of a man examining something he might have become under different conditions. He didn't examine that recognition for long. It wasn't useful tonight. "You'll write it all down," he said to Vael. "Full account, everything Aldoran provided, every instruction, every communication, dates and methods. In exchange, I'll register with the duchy's records that your cooperation was voluntary and complete, which will be the only mitigating factor available to you when this goes to the territorial court." He stood. "You have until morning." He left Vael with paper, a guard, and the specific understanding that the morning would arrive regardless. What? It was the second hour past midnight when they finally reached the upper study. The door had been rehung on an emergency bracket by one of Den's men, functional if not elegant, and the room beyond it was intact. The desk locked, the drawer inside it holding everything he needed. He sat at the desk. She took the chair across from it, which by now had the quality of a familiar position. He opened the drawer, looked at the documents. At the name list he had begun writing the morning the councilmen had come at 4 a.m. with a resolution and a fear they hadn't known how to hide. The list had grown since then. Most of the names on it were now resolved, contained or cooperative or no longer a variable. He set the list aside. He looked at her. She had the bruise on her forearm, visible below the ruined cuff, and her hair had come entirely free of the stable cord sometime during the evening's events. And she was sitting in the chair with the particular stillness of a body that has done everything it was required to do and is now letting itself be still. She looked tired, not damaged. Tired in the way of people who have spent their resources on something worth spending them on. "The man in the corridor," she said, the voice in the dark. "He was Aldrin's insurance," Cassian said. "Someone positioned to tell me the real shape of the thing if the operation failed, to make clear that tonight was a message rather than a complete action. Aldoran wanted me to know he had resources I hadn't anticipated." He paused. "It was correctly calculated. I didn't anticipate it." "What does that change?" "The river dispute is now a different category of problem. It requires a different category of response." He was quiet for a moment. "But not tonight." She looked at him. "Not tonight," she agreed. The fire in the study grate had burned down to coals. The window showed the specific darkness that preceded dawn. Not fully black anymore, but not light. The color of things that haven't decided yet. Cassian sat at his desk in his damaged assembly clothes and looked at the woman across from it and felt, with a clarity that had nothing to do with strategy or calculation, the full weight of what 11 years of governing a duchy through control and information management had not given him, which was this: a person in the room who was not there because he had positioned them there. She was there because she had chosen to be. Past the fence and the ledger and the letter and the announcement and the corridor in the dark and the wall she had driven herself into to hold the satchel. Every single one of those moments had contained a door, and she had not walked through any of them. He understood, sitting at the desk with the coals going gray in the grate, that this was the thing he had not known how to want. Not loyalty purchased, not presence arranged, not someone positioned where they were useful. Someone who had looked at all the available exits and decided to remain anyway. "I owe you a full accounting," he said. "You owe me a lot of things," she said. There was no edge in it, just the same directness she had walked in with, unchanged by the evening, unchanged by any of it. "The posting was designed for your profile." "That's true. Everything after it was not designed." He held her gaze. "I am not a man who has been honest about what I want. In 11 years of holding this duchy, I have wanted things and pursued them by the most efficient available method and called that governance. I don't know how to do this the other way." The other way being wanting something and simply saying so. She was quiet. Then, "What do you want, Cassian?" First name. She had never used it before. He felt it land with a precision that no title had ever achieved in 11 years of being addressed by his position. He looked at her across the desk that had held his father's accounts, and his own, and every difficult decision the duchy had required of him, and he said, "I want you to stay. Not because the announcement was made. Not because the 60 days require it. Not because you are useful to Ravenshire, though you are, More than you know. He paused, breathed through what it cost to say the next part plainly. Because in 11 days you walked into my walls and saw what was actually wrong instead of what was manageable, and you said so every time, and you held the satchel against a man who outweighed you because you understood it mattered. And I have been running this duchy for over a decade, and I have never once had someone in it who did what you do, which is the same thing whether the cost is high or low. She looked at him for a long time. That's the most words you've said at once that weren't about governance, she said. Yes, he said. I'm aware. She stood, came around the desk. He turned the chair to face her, and she stood in front of him and looked down at him with the gray-green eyes that had never once in any situation they had occupied together looked away first. I'll stay, she said, not because of the announcement, not because of the 60 days, because Ravenshire has the hardest horses and the most complicated man I've ever worked alongside, and I have never been able to leave the thing that isn't finished. She paused. You're not finished. He reached up and took her hand. She let him. No, he said. I'm not. Thumbed. Morning came the way mornings come after long nights, without asking whether anyone was ready. The light found the east tower window first, the same window where Cassian had stood counting torches in the courtyard on the night the councilmen came, which felt like a different era now, though it was less than a month ago. He was at that window again when the light came, but the room behind him was different. The drawer was locked. The documents were secured. Den had a full overnight report on his desk. Vane had submitted a formal accounting. Soren Vale had written through the night and produced 40 pages of documentation that would, with proper authentication and territorial court filing, constitute the most complete record of external interference in duchy governance that the Northern Territories had seen in 2 generations. It was enough. More than enough. It was the kind of enough that didn't leave room for counter-narrative. He heard her in the corridor before she knocked. He had learned her footstep the way he'd learned the fortress's night sounds, as information, as something the background of his attention had started cataloging without instruction. Come in, he said. She was in her work clothes. She had slept for 3 hours in the east wing room that had been prepared for her, which was 3 hours more than he'd managed, and she looked like a person who had processed the night and set it in its appropriate place and was now prepared for what came next. Perrin, she said. I know. Have you? Not yet. I was waiting until I was certain. He turned from the window. Last night, the timing of the information in the stable. He told me about Harst's men 40 minutes after they arrived, which should have been immediate. He knew about the lower passage. He is the only person besides myself who knew about it. She nodded. Her face had the specific quality of someone who has already worked through the grief of a betrayal and arrived at the other side of it, not unmarked, but functional. She had trusted Perrin. She had worked beside him for 11 days. She had brought him the ledger, which had been the right thing to do, and he had been a conduit she hadn't known about. He's not like Reeves, she said. He didn't build it. He was built into it. Yes, Cassian said. Reeves recruited him the same way he recruited the undersecretary and the runner, gradually, through accumulated obligation. What happens to him? He leaves Ravenshire's employ, formally, with a record that is accurate but not prosecutorial. He looked at her. He's 61 years old, and he has worked these stables since before I held the duchy, and he was used by a man who understood exactly which kind of loyalty was vulnerable to pressure. I'm not going to destroy him for that. I'm going to end his access and make sure he understands why. She was quiet for a moment. Then, that's different from what I expected. From me specifically, or from the situation generally? From you specifically. He held her gaze. I have been reconsidering the categories, he said. What requires destruction and what requires something else? She looked at him with a quality of attention that he understood, after 31 days of learning what her attention looked like, was the highest form of regard she was capable of extending. It was not warmth, exactly. It was the acknowledgement of a person who saw clearly and was choosing to say so. Good, she said. He spoke to Perrin in the lower stable office at the 8th hour, the same room where he'd first met Seraphina, the same 2 chairs and the window and the silence that the room held naturally. Perrin came in knowing. Cassian could see it in the way he walked, The particular gait of a man who has spent a night deciding whether to run and has determined that running is no longer available and has arrived at whatever comes after that decision. He sat without being asked. Cassian looked at him for a moment. 22 years. The man had known his father, had saddled horses for Cassian when Cassian was 12 years old, and had not yet learned how to occupy his own height, had run the most technically complex stable operation in the Northern Territories with a competence that had never once required supervision. "How long?" Cassian said. 14 months, Perrin said. His voice was steady. "It started with a debt my son had. A business debt. Reeves had the note. He offered to forgive it in exchange for information. I told myself it would be minor. General information about the stable operations. Nothing that would matter." His hands were flat on his thighs, very still. "It escalated, and I didn't stop it because by the time I understood what I was too far in to see a way out that didn't destroy my son along with me." And the lower passage. "I told Reeves about it 3 months ago. I didn't know what it would be used for." Cassian sat with that. He believed it. He believed the whole of it, not because Perrin was incapable of more complex deception, but because the specific shape of it, the escalation, the debt, the protection of a child at the expense of everything else, was not a story someone constructed. It was a story someone lived. "Your son's debt," Cassian said. "What was the amount?" Perrin told him. It was not a small number. It was also not, relative to the duchy's resources, a significant one. "I'll settle it," Cassian said, "through the estate accounts, documented as resolution of a legitimate claim against an employee of long standing." He watched Perrin's face move through something that had no adequate name. "You will leave Ravenshire's employ at the end of the month. The record will note exemplary service over 22 years and retirement due to personal circumstances. Your pension stands. Your son's debt will be clear." "Your Grace," Perrin's voice had lost its steadiness, just at the end. "I know," Cassian said. "You don't have to." He stood. Perrin stood. They looked at each other across the room and across 22 years and across the specific complicated terrain of a relationship that had been built on something real and had survived being used against both of them without quite breaking. "She found the passage records," Cassian said. Not accusatory, just placing it. Perrin closed his eyes briefly. "I know. I put them there for Reeves, and I told her which plank was loose." He paused. "I told myself it wasn't directly harmful, that she would bring them to you and you would handle it." Another pause. "I also told myself that if it gave you reason to trust her, maybe something good came from it." He meant it. Cassian could hear that too. "Something did," he said, "but not because you arranged it." He moved toward the door. "Goodbye, Perrin." "Your Grace." He left the stable office and walked into the yard where the morning light was full and cold across the stones, and Valdres was standing at the fence of his pen watching the activity of a Ravenshire that had come through a night it had not entirely prepared for and was now conducting the business of mourning. Serafina was at the fence. She had a hand on the horse's neck, and she was not looking at the animal. She was looking at the castle, at the upper walls and the banners above them, at the specific profile of a fortress built from centuries of other people's capitulation, and her face had an expression he had not seen on her before, which was not the readiness and not the cold focus and not the aftermath of the night's events. It was something quieter than all of those, something that looked like a person arriving at a place they had not expected to arrive at and finding it larger than they had calculated. He came to stand beside her at the fence. "He had a reason," Cassian said. "He always had a reason," she said. "People always have reasons. The reasons are almost always true. It doesn't change what the thing was." "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." They stood at the fence. Valdres moved along the rail toward Cassian, which he had not done before. The horse stopped a foot away and regarded him with the unhurried assessment of an animal that has decided to extend provisional trust and is communicating the terms. Cassian raised his hand slowly, the way he had watched her do it, and Valdres accepted it on his nose. He felt her looking at him. "He chose you," she said. "He's choosing," Cassian said. "There's a difference." She was quiet for a moment, then very quietly, Yes, there is. He lowered his hand. The horse stayed. The three of them stood at the fence in the winter morning, with the smoke from the castle's fires rising into the cold sky, and the south road empty below the gate, and the ridge to the east beginning to take the full weight of the day's light. He thought about Aldoran in the Duchy of Morn, waiting for a report from Soren Vale that was not going to arrive in the form he expected. He thought about the territorial court and the months of process ahead. He thought about a council that needed to be rebuilt with people who held their positions for reasons that could withstand scrutiny, and a garrison that needed a new second officer, and a household staff that needed to be examined with the specific attention that you gave to any structure after a storm, looking for the damage that didn't announce itself. All of it was real. All of it was coming. None of it was this morning. This morning was the fence and the horse and the light and the woman beside him who had come to Ravenshire to break difficult animals and had instead broken something in him that he had been maintaining closed for 11 years, and who was standing here now not because she had been positioned here, but because she had decided that the complicated man and the unfinished work and the fortress on the cliff were worth remaining for. He thought about the version of himself that had stood at this same window counting torches, and feeling the specific cold of a man who has built everything around the management of threat and has nothing left that isn't threatened. He thought about what it had cost to build that version, the years of learning to want only what could be controlled, the systematic removal of anything that couldn't be secured or predicted or leveraged. He thought about 11 days, about a fence and a horse that chose to approach, and a woman who brought him evidence of corruption because she couldn't leave broken things alone, and the way those two things were the same quality expressed differently. He thought about what it meant that the duchy was more intact this morning than it had been in years, not because he had controlled everything, but because at the critical moments he had stopped trying to. Power, he understood now, with the earned clarity of a man who has run a complete circuit of its limits, was not the capacity to dominate. Any frightened man with sufficient resources could dominate. Power was the capacity to stand in the center of a situation you had not fully designed and make the right decision anyway. Power was what remained when the thing you had built to protect you had been tested and had held, not because it was impenetrable, but because what was inside it was worth holding. He had spent 11 years learning that. He had learned the rest of it in 31 days. He turned to her. "The 60 days," he said. "Yes," she said. "I won't spend them managing you." "I know. I will spend them learning how to do this differently than I've done everything else." She looked at him, at the face that had been broken and reset and scarred and had never once in his adult life communicated warmth by accident, and she looked at it now in the morning light with the specific attention of a person who sees what is actually there rather than what the context suggests. "You already started," she said. He took her hand. She let him, the way she had in the study the night before, without ceremony, without the performance of significance, simply letting it be the thing it was. They stood at the fence until Valdris moved away into the center of his pen, satisfied with whatever he had determined, and the morning continued around them with all its requirements and all its unfinished work, and all the long days ahead that would need exactly what they both had, which was the willingness to see what was actually broken and say so and stay anyway. The banners of Ravenshire moved above them in the winter wind. Below the cliff, the valley spread out in its full winter clarity, smoke from the village, the south road quiet, the ridge catching the last of the cold light before the clouds moved in, as they always did, as they had every winter for as long as the fortress had stood on the cliff above them. It had stood because it was built to stand. It would stand now for different reasons. Cassian Blackthorn looked at the valley that was his to keep and felt for the first time in 11 years of keeping it that the weight of it was not something he was carrying alone. He did not say this out loud. He didn't need to. She was already looking at the same valley with the same quality of attention, and between them at the fence was the specific silence of two people who have said the important things and have arrived at the place on the other side of them, where what remains is not words, but the long work of becoming what they promised. The wind came off the ridge. The banners held.